Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. My name is Emilie Gao, and I'm the director of the Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society. One of the 4 critical goals of our organization is to build an America where civil society flourishes. We know that America will only be as healthy as the next generation. But today, we see an unhealthy and a dangerous trend of the sexualization of children through culture, education, and healthcare, sometimes even aided by government initiatives and financed by taxpayer money. Here are a few examples of how children are being sexualized. 42% of children between the ages of 10 to 17 report having seen pornography. A recent poll of 2,000 teenagers found that nearly 75% had received pornographic direct messages from strangers, even though they had a private account. And as the New York Times just reported, the internet is awash with more than 45 million images and videos of child sexual abuse. We are here today because adults must stand up to other adults to protect children. The speakers are leading experts from around the country who have been in the trenches, fighting to protect the innocence of children from a wide variety of influences in culture and education, including pornography, the legalization of prostitution, adult entertainment in children's spaces, and efforts to infuse K-12 curriculum with graphic sexual content. The House of Representatives recently passed the Equality Act. It could lead courts to require controversial K-12 curriculum on sexual orientation and gender identity nationwide. The act would not only undermine parental rights in education, it could also do the same in healthcare. Already, transgender ideology is hastening children who are uncomfortable with their bodies down the path of sex reassignment, even though they may be too young to drive a car or to get a tattoo. All people have dignity and should be treated with respect, including those with gender dysphoria, and especially children. But the euphemistic term gender affirmative care cannot obscure the tragic side effects of hormonal and surgical interventions. The Equality Act would reduce non-invasive alternatives for parents of children with gender dysphoria. Many of these courageous panelists have paid a heavy price for speaking out, from losing job opportunities, to being vilified in the media, to being harassed and even threatened with violence. They have chosen to pay this price and to risk further retaliation because what they fight for is too important to ignore: the innocence, safety, and security of all American children. That's what's at stake today. The stories, the data, the policies you will learn about are important not just for parents with children in public schools or on social media or who struggle with gender dysphoria. Today's event is for everyone who cares about children because the influences in our society are too pervasive to hide from. You may hear things today that are disturbing, shocking, and heartbreaking. We hope your response will not be to stay silent, but to tell others about what you've heard and to join us in engaging family, friends, communities, and lawmakers to protect the future of America by protecting children from sexualization. For starters, we encourage you to share what you've learned from today's event on social media, and on Twitter, we will be using the hashtag #ProtectKids as we live tweet the event. And now I'm delighted to introduce you our co-host for today's event, Amanda Banks, the External Policy Director of the Family Policy Alliance, who will briefly describe their work. Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome to the Summit on Protecting Children from Sexualization. It promises to be an enlightening and impactful day. As the mom of 3 little girls, I am acutely aware of and concerned about the early sexualization of our youth. As the Director of External Relations at Family Policy Alliance, I'm encouraged to be among friends and allies today as we examine this important issue and look for solutions to protect our children. For those of you unfamiliar with Family Policy Alliance, or FPA, we're an alliance of engaged citizens, elected statesmen, and 40 state policy organizations, many of which are represented here today. So Family Policy Council directors and staff, if you can give a little wave, I'd love to see your hands. All right, thank you. As a public policy partner of Focus on the Family, our alliance shares a common vision of a nation where God is honored, religious freedom flourishes, families thrive, and life is cherished. We promote biblical citizenship by educating the electorate, advocating for pro-family legislation, engaging churches and mobilizing voters, and working to elect and train statesmen. Our foundation, Statesman Academy, has been equipping legislators for effective, Christ-centered public service since 2016, and this summer we surpassed our 100th graduate of the Academy. At Family Policy Alliance, two of our top priorities are protecting children and empowering parents. That's why we're delighted to partner with the Heritage Foundation today on the important topic of child sexualization. I'll also mention a related resource that some of you may have an interest in. We just completed in partnership with Heritage, as well as the Minnesota Family Council, WOLF, the Kelsey Coalition, Parents of Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria Kids, and the American College of Pediatricians. It's called the Parent Resource Guide. And it's a one-stop shop for educating and equipping parents and other concerned citizens to respond compassionately and effectively on the transgender issue. It includes an overview of the transgender trend, activism in our schools, tips for communicating with school leaders, and advocating for common sense policies. We have some copies available today, and the guide is also available for download online at genderresourceguide.com. If you're interested in that resource, please feel free to contact me afterwards, and I'll get you a copy. So with that, let me say welcome once more, and thank you, Heritage, for hosting us today.
Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us here today at the Heritage Foundation for this important event. My name is Greg Scott. I'm the Director of Media here at the Heritage Foundation. Emilie and Amanda set the table so well, and we have such a powerful lineup of speakers in this kickoff panel that I'm going to limit my introductory remarks and get right to the content that you want to hear. We've all heard the soul-crushing stories of national and international stories of children being abused and exploited in churches, athletics, schools, the streets, seemingly everywhere, many times with dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of victims over years and over decades. You probably all read the story in the New York Times last week that reported that there's something like 45 million images and videos of children being exploited and raped across the internet right now. That story should be more shocking than it actually is. It's believable in today's day and age. We all ask, how did this happen? Why didn't anyone stop it? Why does it keep happening, and what do we do about it? When abuse and exploitation is revealed, we all understand that victims deserve justice, that the predators must be brought to justice, and as a society, we have a duty to cry out for justice for the victims. But have we properly confronted the social and cultural trends that have created conditions under which children have been sexualized and groomed as targets of various exploitation? That is a conversation we're going to begin this morning. We'll cover the activists who openly, boldly, and even proudly declare their intention to cheerlead children into early sexualization. We'll also examine more below-the-radar tectonic forces that are less transparent about their objectives, but no less dangerous to vulnerable children. Our first panel includes women who've been on the cultural front lines, studying, advocating, writing, and engaging in direct action in their communities to protect children. I'm going to introduce them all right now, and you'll hear some very powerful stories and testimonies from them about what they are doing. I'm going to start first with Maddie Kearns on the end. Maddie is a journalism fellow at the National Review Institute and a full-time writer at National Review Online, who has also been published in The Spectator, Wall Street Journal, and The Telegraph. Maddie will offer a brief history of the transgender movement and how it has and continues to contribute to the sexualization of children. Next will be Halverson, who is the Vice President of Advocacy and Outreach for the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. She will discuss the impacts of pornography exposure on children, online grooming for sexual abuse, and sex trafficking and the harms of fully decriminalizing prostitution. Next will be Natasha Chart, who chairs the board of directors for the Women's Liberation Front. WOLF describes its members as unapologetically radical feminists dedicated to the total liberation of women. Natasha will provide a powerful testimony about the grooming of children for sexual exploitation and cultural and educational trends that are making children more vulnerable. Finally will be Georgia Kijesky. She is the founder of Personhood Maryland and a state affiliate of the Personhood Alliance. Georgia will share some stories about the work she has done in her own community against the sexualization of children via their exposure to lewd adult nightclub acts and training, which is now promoted in public buildings across the country. Will you welcome our panel?
Thank you. So I've been asked to talk about the origins of transgenderism and how it relates to children and their exploitation. But first, I would actually like to start with a little story. So yesterday, I was wandering around outside the Supreme Court, chatting with some people who were there to support what's known as the LGBTQ+ community. And I spoke with a lovely guy who identified as homosexual, and then 4 teenage girls who identify as lesbian and queer. And they asked me what I thought of the Human Rights Campaign, so I told them up front that I think it's a force for tremendous harm in this country. And then I asked them what they thought of Martin Luther King's idea, you know, the one about not defining people by irrelevant characteristics like their skin color, or in this case, their sexual desires. And they thought that sounded like a very good idea. And later, 2 men who were slightly less open-minded wanted to tell me about some horrible, horrible feminists called TERFs, who apparently are in cahoots with an even more horrible right-wing institution I probably hadn't heard of because I'm Scottish. And it's called... Oh, yes, that's right. It's called the Heritage Foundation. So if anyone knows anyone from there, just let me know, because I want to make sure I don't, die by association. Anyway, the reason I mention this story, of course, is that other than the Heritage Foundation being a symbol for all that is evil and far right in American politics, my experience of the LGBTQ community yesterday was that it wasn't really a community in as much as it was a big mishmash of people who feel they belong to a certain cause and for very, very different reasons. And yet they were all there at the end of the rainbow to claim their pot of gold, which they had been promised by the Human Rights Campaign. So I've been asked to get to the origins of this movement, and I'm going to try to do that. And of course, as you know, it's just one stripe of the rainbow. And I couldn't possibly do it justice in 10 minutes, but I will do my absolute best. So there's 3 things I think that have been changing since the mid-20th century. The first is in medicine, the second is what I like to call an ontology of desire, and the third is what I like to call the politicization of everything. So let's start with medicine then. Okay, so when sex change surgeries became surgically possible in the post-war period, it was understood to be something of a euphemism. Of course, a person cannot literally change from one sex to the other. It would be more accurate to call it genital surgery, but people are trying to be euphemistic. And they were highly controversial, in part because they weren't always that successful. You might have seen the movie The Danish Girl. But you're familiar, of course, with the Heritage Foundation's Ryan Anderson's book, and he talks a lot about Paul McHugh, who had put an end to these surgeries in the 1970s, which he described as collaborating with madness, is how he called it. But people who wanted to change sex back then, they were called transsexuals, and that was a term popularized by an endocrinologist, Harry Benjamin. And demand was fairly low. It was mostly males wanting to become females, and for the most part, it's complicated, of course, but for the most part, sexologists kind of realized that there was 2 types of male to female transsexual. There was the homosexual transsexual, and that's the person who feels inconspicuously feminine and uncomfortable as a man, and is actually kind of a deeply sympathetic figure, I think. And then there's the autogynephiliac, and that's a person who finds the concept of themselves as a woman to be sexually exciting. And studies of interviews with such individuals And these are sexologists who have done these studies. So Ray Blanchard or Anne Lawrence, you can look it up if you think I'm making it up. This would be anything ranging from a man who's turned on from, you know, the checkout assistant calling him ma'am, to somebody who likes to urinate on sanitary pads to pretend they're menstruating, and many other things that I think many of us would find maybe slightly too unpleasant to dwell on so early in the morning. So anyway, in my friend's new book, The Madness of Crowds, Douglas Murray explains that the struggle for defining things turned into this hardware versus software issue, right? So intersex, for instance, is very much a hardware issue, and you can't exactly get concerned about somebody who has a hardware issue, because that's not their fault, is it? And so, of course, the reality, as we know with homosexuality, there's a big study that came out recently, is that it's most likely some kind of combination of the two. People may be predisposed to certain proclivities, but environment and so on and so forth. But in any case, just Martin Luther King's point, don't define people by that. But anyway, and this kind of brings me on to my second point, which was about what I'm calling the ontology of desire. And that's basically when in the 1990s, lots of things happened. I was born, for instance, but that's actually not relevant. So anyway, in the 1990s, the definition of trans began to change, and transsexualism as a sexual fetish, it had been known as the sexual fetish part had been known as a perversion. This was politically incorrect, so they changed it to paraphilia, which became politically incorrect and is now known as an identity. And it's actually still listed in the Diagnostic Statistical Manuals of Mental Disorders, so it's still disorder in the DSM, but that will likely change. And transgenderism was adopted and celebrated in the academy, in large part thanks to people like Judith Butler, who thought that gender was a performance. And this is where it gets really interesting, and the contradictions all come out, because on the one hand, and this is my friend Douglas Murray's point, is on the one hand you have transgenderism is a hardware issue for trans people, but for everyone else, gender is a software issue. So if you think about it, the only people who are born women are trans women, which is rather an astonishing claim, I would have thought. Anyway, so this is where comes the idea of the whole boy's brain in a girl's body, which turns out to be really a little more than a metaphor. And a more accurate metaphor might be that of a soul, a gendered soul, the fundamental essence of a person. This actually goes back a very long way, the Gnostic heresies in ancient times, the idea that matter's kind of less important, it's all about your spirit, your essence. So anyway, why am I mentioning this? I can't remember, but oh yeah, that's right. So the expectations around language evolved so far and so quickly that basically everybody calling a trans woman she, okay, initially that was meant to be a courtesy. We're just trying to accommodate people, not make somebody who's had a hard life have a harder life. Now it's meant to signal our absolute, uncontested belief in their femaleness, which of course it doesn't, because trans women are men. And there's nothing wrong with being a man, actually, I don't think. I mean, I understand some people don't want to be men, and fair enough, but anyway, okay, so then the third point is the massive cultural and political tidal wave. Because the thing is, in the 1990s, back when I was, learning how to speak and stuff, people might have been forgiven for thinking, oh, this will never catch on. This is so outrageous. This is absurd. And they would obviously be right. But the thing was, the internet and all these other things came into play. And society had just got used to defining whole sections of the population by their desires with regards to homosexuality, which, it should be noted, was trying to correct genuine injustices that gay people faced in this country and still face across the world. But they overcorrected and they became obsessed with identity. And so what happened as we moved further and further away from the sort of vision that Martin Luther King set out is we started to lose sight of all these different intricacies I've just set out with regards to sexuality. And then trans piggybacked onto gay rights, which had piggybacked onto civil rights, and a whole system of buzzwords popped up, like transphobia, which I was saying to someone last night, kind of sounds like a place to me. I just think transphobia, you know, anyway. And then like trans misogyny, and then conversion therapy, and all these kind of buzzwords that every time someone brings them up, you get scared and you think, gosh, I don't want to be on the wrong side of history. I should say though, when I was at this thing yesterday, and I was like with the LGBT crowd, and the police moved, and then we were walking down towards the Supreme Court, it did kind of feel like it was this big angry mob chasing a bunch of women, which I have to say didn't really feel like being on the right side of history. But maybe I'll be proven wrong. Anyway, but the point about civil rights is very, very important, and it's perhaps why I don't really get it as much coming from a different country. Is that in America, people are rightly very, very, very sensitive about civil rights and their very embarrassing history in that area. And so they don't want to repeat that, and I think that's a good impulse, and we should respect that impulse. But of course, it's been used by people like the Human Rights Campaign for their own cynical ends. Which brings me on to the final point. I was getting there, I promise. What has any of this got to do with sexualizing children? Well, firstly, I want to take a drink of water, and then I'll explain. Okay, firstly, I want to suggest two things. I think the first is that it's created a massive, massive cultural blind spot. The entire field of psychology, which was understood, has always understood transgenderism, transsexualism to relate to adult sexuality. And we can have a debate about whether we think urinating on sanitary pads is normal behavior or not. We can have that debate, but it is about sexuality, okay? Has been masked. It's been masked by an ideology. And because of the politics of it all, there's a great fear for many people, and it's a legitimate fear because they might get fired or worse for signaling some terrible obia, this actually becomes very obvious in the subject of drag, right? So, drag, which just means dress as girl, comes from the Elizabethan period when women were forbidden from performing publicly, and so they assumed the role of women. And for some drag queens, I was speaking to one yesterday, it really is about performance. And do you know, I come from the UK where we have this genre of theatre called the pantomime, and it's funny, you know, it's just like funny. It's just like men dress up as women. I think it's funny, like it's fine. But the thing is, right, is things are very context dependent. So this drag queen yesterday, his name's James Davis, although when he's on stage, he's called Elaine Lancaster. He was agreeing with me. He was saying that, like, while for him it's about performance, he recognizes that when he's in bars, when he's in different places, people come up to him at the end and it's all about sex for them, right? And as an adult who knows that and understands that, he can deal with it, right? He can say whether he wants to get involved in that or whether he doesn't. It's a free country. But why would we put children in that situation? Why would we invite salacious interest in children by dressing them up in drag? We shouldn't do that. And I'm referring here to a whole new phenomenon now called drag kids. And the argument we're supposed to accept rather unthinkingly is that, oh, you're just being bigoted and you're just got prejudice because this is just about self-expression and this is just about this, that, and the next thing. And actually, I'm thinking, well, no, because yes, children dress up, right? But again, it's context dependent. So the analogy I would invite you to think about here is imagine a little girl in a bikini, okay? Like she's 13 years old. She's in her parents' private pool, okay? Is it a big problem she's wearing a bikini? No, it's not a big problem she's wearing a bikini. She's in her parents' private pool. Okay, same girl, same bikini. She's 13 years old. She's walking down a catwalk in front of a room full of adults. Do we all feel uncomfortable? Yes, we all feel uncomfortable. It's a completely different thing. And it's the same thing with this drag thing. So this is not hypothetical. I invite you to look up the case of Desmond is Amazing, who should really be called Desmond Needs Saving, because this poor little boy is dressed up, gyrating in gay clubs in Brooklyn, and nobody's allowed to say anything because to say so would be homophobic. Well, no, sorry, because this drag queen agrees with me, and plenty of people who are gay and lesbian, they would say the same thing on this. It's just not on. So anyway, to conclude all this, our friends over at the Human Rights Campaign would prefer that none of us knew about any of these intricacies, that people like me didn't exist to remind you of them, that people like James, the drag queen, didn't exist, or that those open-minded people at the LGBT rally who thought that Martin Luther King had a point didn't exist. They would prefer that the only people who opposed sexualization of children were the horrible, frightening, right-wing bogeyman, the Heritage Foundation. And everyone else that was too scared so everyone who's too scared to talk about this, like, we just have to get over that, because there's too much at stake. I'm sorry to say, and to be honest, like, you know, the worst thing that they can do is say that you're the bogeyman, and then you just go boo, and then just that's it, you're done. Anyway, that's me. Thanks.
All right, a lot to discuss today. As was mentioned, I work for the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to exposing the links between all forms of sexual exploitation and abuse, because we can't solve one of them in a vacuum. We need to address all of them and their interconnections. So in the true spirit of this, today I'm going to talk to you about the impact of pornography exposure on children, how children are being groomed for sexual abuse and sex trafficking online, and about some dangerous new policy proposals to fully decriminalize prostitution, which are all facing our country. Because all of these three issues involve sexually harming or exploiting children in some form. So first, in order to dismantle this great web of sexual exploitation and harm, it's vital for us to recognize the public health harms of pornography. Like all other public health issues, not everyone who is exposed has the same response. However, for many, repeat exposure leads to a myriad of harms on adolescent development, relationships, and even sexual function. Pornography, we all know, is pervasive online. A study of university students found that 93% of boys and 62% of girls have been exposed in adolescence. That rate is only increasing and that age is only decreasing. I know kids who are exposed to pornography while playing age-appropriate video games, kids exposed in school on school-given devices, school-given iPads and tablets because they don't have filters on them. Just a few weeks ago, a young boy's mother wrote to our organization because he was doing a school homework assignment on slavery, did a simple Google search of just the word bondage, and was immediately, in 0.2 seconds flat, exposed to photos showing clear penetration and live links to violent pornography. It is no longer a question of if children will be exposed to pornography, it is a question of when. And the public health damages are clear, according to the research. Since 2011, there have been 40 peer-reviewed studies revealing pornography has negative impacts on the brain, structure, and development. Pornography, like a drug, hijacks the brain's natural sexual reward systems, so that many users experience a need to escalate to more extreme content over time, whether that is greater volume, more violent, or even acting out on others in order to get the same high as before, like we see with other addictions. Most mainstream pornography displays violence against women. In fact, a 2018 study found that 90% of teenage females in porn displayed pleasure in response to physical aggression. This means that pornography, which is the new sexual education of rising generations, has a primary lesson: that no means yes, and that violence is sexy. Knowing the message that pornography sends and the impact that it has on the brain, it's therefore not surprising to see that there's a link between pornography and sexual violence offline. A meta-analysis of 46 studies reported pornography puts people at increased risks for committing sexual offenses and accepting rape myths. The study said that these effects are clear and consistent across the research. Further, there is a rising crisis of children who are sexually abusing other children. This is an unspoken crisis in our country right now. And the research finds that children who are exposed to pornography are 3.3 times more likely to actually act out in a problematic sexual way, and that harms another child, typically because they were acting out what they saw in pornography. Because of these and other harms, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation has authored a state resolution declaring pornography to be a public health crisis, and it has passed in 15 states already. These resolutions are non-binding. They do not require tax dollars, but they help to raise awareness. And the National Center's Law Center has drafted more model legislation to build on that momentum to help combat pornography at the state level. Second, we know that pornography actually overlaps with the online epidemic of grooming children for sexual abuse and sex trafficking. For example, a few months ago, I was meeting with 3 young girls, 14 and 15 years old, who were sex trafficking survivors here in DC. They showed me their Instagram accounts, and even though their accounts were set to private, they were receiving on a weekly basis dozens of direct messages from strangers, men in DC, reaching out to them, telling them they're beautiful, asking them to meet up, asking for sexually explicit photos, sending them sexually explicit photos. Sometimes they complimented the girls, got them to feel loved, feel like they were their boyfriends. Sometimes they used sexually explicit photos that they got from the girls to blackmail them, to extort them into sex trafficking. Sometimes both. These girls shared how almost universally these men would use pornography of sex trafficked girls to advertise them online for sale, or would use live stream features on Instagram, Twitter, or Snapchat to auction them off to sex buyers. While exploiters are seeking to groom and abuse children in the olden days, used to have to find them in person, now they can reach children anonymously with just a few clicks of a button. All this, and yet Instagram is rated as safe for children 12+, along with Snapchat and TikTok, which have all been methods used by sex traffickers and abusers to groom and abuse children. These app ratings are misleading, and they leave parents and children unaware of the risks that are involved, because each app gets to rate itself. Right now, the industry has no accountability or transparency to make safe digital spaces for children. There are 2 solutions that we need from the tech industry. First, we need both devices and social media apps to embrace age-based default safety settings, where by default safety features are turned on and you have to go and intentionally turn them off. This would be the opposite of our current system, which assumes that you want 0 safety measures, and then parents or an individual has to go searching for safety controls. Sometimes, like on the Apple iPhone, this includes over 30 steps to make it fully safe. Second, we need an independent app rating review board with sanctioning power for noncompliance. This system would be similar to the ratings board that we already have for the movie and the video game industry. It operates independently of government, run by a cross-section of industry and child development experts. While Congress would have no control over this independent board, we are calling on Congress to request that the tech industry takes the initiative to set up this review board and have some transparency and accountability. We also have ways that grassroots individuals can get involved with online actions to hold corporations like Twitter accountable by emailing corporate executives, partaking in social media campaigns at dirtydozenlist.com, which is an annual campaign that names 12 mainstream companies facilitating sexual exploitation. I'm grateful to say that while these are dark subjects, there are so many victories to be won in this space, because at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, we've been very successful. We've gotten 4 major hotel chains to stop selling on-demand pornography in their rooms. That impacts 2 million rooms around the world. We've gotten the Army, Air Force, and Navy to stop selling pornography on their bases. We've gotten Google to stop linking ads to pornography. There are victories to be had here, and so I encourage you to take part at dirtydozenlist.com. Third, in the midst of this pornography epidemic and the rampant online grooming for abuse, there's at the same time a national campaign by some pro-prostitution lobbyists to fully decriminalize prostitution in America. So far, there have been around a dozen states, from New York, New Hampshire, Hawaii, California, and even Washington, D.C., that have or are actively considering fully decriminalizing prostitution. What does that mean? Fully decriminalizing prostitution not only decriminalizes the seller, typically individuals dealing with socioeconomic disadvantages and multiple layers of trauma and coercion, but also the pimps and sex traffickers who exploit them and the sex buyers who buy and abuse them. This would lead to an exponential boom in the commercial sexual exploitation marketplace. In Germany, where prostitution and brothels have been legal since 2002, an estimated 1 million men buy sex every day. a 2018 study of 8,000 US men said over 20% of them who had never bought sex would consider doing it if it was legal. So, to meet this increased demand in a fully decriminalized system, the sex trade would lure, manipulate, and coerce more vulnerable people because there are never enough women willing to be exploited and degraded in the system of prostitution. And so, unsurprisingly, a study from London School of Economics of 150 different countries found that wherever prostitution is legalized and legitimized, sex trafficking increases. And this certainly includes the sex trafficking of children. Prostitution itself is a system of sexual exploitation that causes physical and mental trauma that cannot be regulated away. The only way to protect people is to shrink that marketplace. And so it is frightening that in Washington, D.C., we're having a hearing on October 17th, the Washington, D.C. Sitting Council, where it's seriously considering fully decriminalizing prostitution and turning our nation's capital into an international sex trade tourism destination. This is imminent, and anyone involved in D.C. should contact us to get involved. So these three actions I leave with you. First, we must recognize the public health harms of pornography, both culturally and formal state resolutions. Second, we must hold app companies accountable for creating safe digital spaces for children to prevent grooming for child sex trafficking and abuse. And third, we must hold the line against pro-prostitution lobbyists on a state-by-state basis to prevent the explosion of the sexual exploitation marketplace. In short, we are all responsible for challenging sexual exploitation in any of its forms at any step. Pornography, online grooming for sexual abuse, sex trafficking, prostitution are seamlessly connected, and we must form policy and activism accordingly. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Natasha Chart from the Women's Liberation Front. I'm the volunteer board chair. I'm as disappointed as some of you surely are that this spot isn't filled by someone from RAINN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, the nation's largest anti-sexual violence organization. I am sure they would have had a lot of great things to say, but they were harassed into declining to attend. As a survivor of intimate partner violence, and someone who's really offended that the pornography industry has tried to turn that into something that's sexy, and other harrowing experiences, I always thought that it would be good for more people to listen to our stories and try to understand how to keep these things from happening to others and happening in the future. Abuse happens in every community, in every type of human institution. So ideally, a broad range of us would be involved in finding solutions because there's a problem wherever we are. And I don't know when the goal changed from asking people to listen to telling them that we just don't have anything to say. And I don't agree with that. And so I have some things to say. So first, I grew up in something of a cult. I was raised a Jehovah's Witness. And instead of being taught that, though you do have to watch out for bad people everywhere, most people are decent, I was taught that most people everywhere were bad. When I ran away at 17, I would now think of it as having been groomed, if unintentionally, to assume that the worst of human behavior was normal, that libertine behavior was normal. My expectations of my fellow humans were extremely low. But I just didn't want to stay where I was. Even 30 years later, I still have some emotion about this, and so maybe you can think back and guess how easy it was for adults to look at this angry 17-year-old who'd been convinced by grown men flirting with me that I was wise beyond my years. This was not true. And conclude that I was like the perfect mark for a would-be pimp. A man I didn't know very well asked me out, and I now would assume that he knew already that I was a runaway, living with a friend. He took me out to Hollywood Boulevard. We walked through the shops. I saw a leather jacket that I loved. They were very in fashion at the time. I tried it on. It looked great on me. I put it back on the hanger. I looked regretfully at the price tag and walked away. And then he offered to buy it for me. And the man in the shop, takes it off the hanger again, standing there offering it. And I want you to understand that all I wanted to do at that point in my life was rebel from my family, but also to fit in and be like the other kids. Kids who I had been assured were all bad. So if it was bad, I wanted in. But I looked at that man's face and I turned around and I walked out of that store without a word. I didn't have time to think. I just wanted to leave, and so I did. And I kept walking until he caught up with me. He drove me home, and on the way back, he told me how he could introduce me to lots of friends of his who would love to buy me things. So he asked me for another date, and at the time, I couldn't think of a way to say no. But when the day came, I told him I was sick. He showed up unexpectedly with takeout to be sure that I was really homesick and I wasn't, having him on. Honestly, I was feeling a little queasy that day. I had to stop answering the phone for about 2 weeks until he stopped calling. Years later, I was working at a reproductive health and social justice organization, and I'd started noticing an increasing drumbeat in favor of recognizing what was being called sex work as just another job. I wasn't sure what to think about that at the time. I'd put the topic out of my mind for years. And then I started seeing people promoting what they called, quote, youth sex work. So I read more about that because I wasn't an expert. The UN defines youth as people between 15 and 24 years of age. You can see how it might be clear when you're using that term if you're not exactly talking about adults or children, even though it's useful for some public health purposes to define that as its own category. And I started finding in my reading some really alarming examples of nonprofits that have become part of the effort to make the sex industry respectable, who've used that term very irresponsibly. In a guide that continues to be recommended to policymakers and feminist activists called Girls Do What They Have to Do to Survive, Illuminating Methods Used by Girls in the Sex Trade and Street Economy to Fight Back and Heal. This was written in 2009 by a no longer operating organization called the Young Women's Empowerment Project. They define their youth audience like this: girls, including transgender girls, and young women, including trans women, ages 12 to 23, who have current or past experience with any part of the sex trade and street economies. In this guide, which cumulatively described all the means by which society attempts to remove girls and young women from the sex trade as inherently harmful to them, it includes a section titled Soothing Self-Care. This is an excerpt. Some girls also find cutting or injuring themselves as a soothing form of self-care. This led us at YWEP to rename what some people call self-injury or self-mutilation. We now call it self-harm resilience. It continues on in this vein. Other girls wrote about more complicated forms of self-harm resilience, like breaking bones or making cuts or burns on their skin. Rather than judge this as bad or dangerous, we decided to use harm reduction as a way to understand this. And so just imagine the trauma and the need for help that those words hide in a report that closes with this comment on harm reduction. Harm reduction means that all girls involved in the sex trade need to be in charge of their own decisions. And I would submit to you that a young girl who feels like she needs to break her own bones to feel in control of her life is maybe not in a state where she doesn't need anybody's help. In June 2015, a number of small but respected nonprofits released a media guide called Say What? How to Talk About Trans and Gender Nonconforming People, Youth, and People in the Sex Trade respectively. This guide describes it as harmful to use the word kids, teens, or juveniles instead of the terms youth or young people. So they want you to say youth or young people, these indeterminate sorts of words, because they say, quote, people assume teens are incapable of certain leadership roles or don't have the mental capacity, self-control, or understanding to articulate or make good decisions. As a media guide, it also goes on to give examples of other ways to replace what they call harmful terms. These are direct quotes from their suggestions of how to use recommended replacement terms for terms like prostitution or, quote, commercially exploited children. So these are their recommended sentences for journalists to use. Robin has been involved in the sex trade since they were 15 years old. Robin has been trading sex for 5 years now. Robin has identified as a sex worker since they were 15 years old. And the final one, youth in the sex trade, why we should decriminalize sex work. The Audre Lorde Project, named after the famous feminist but started after she passed on, was one of the signatory organizations on that media guide. They're small and you may never have heard of them, but one of their former board members now works at the National Women's Law Center, and she testified on behalf of that organization at one of the Equality Act hearings earlier this year. And I eventually found in my other readings, published on the very website that I worked for, an article called Part of the Solution, Youth in Sex Work and the Sex Trade, that was written in 2010 in direct response to congressional hearings into child trafficking ads on Craigslist. Although the article has been altered since I first drew attention to it, it still includes this assertion. Prohibitions on sex work, even when targeted at third parties such as customers and advertising venues, criminalize young people and force them further underground in order to meet their survival needs. So according to this body of thinking that's being quietly advanced by some progressive nonprofits and foundations, if you put prohibitions on the customers and advertisers of the so-called youth sex trade, you're the one in the position of hurting victims of exploitation. When the author of that piece began promoting Amnesty International's new policy initiative to decriminalize pimping and the purchase of sex from adults in 2015, a policy that was initially proposed by a pimp in one of their UK chapters, I pointed this connection out and I criticized the move on the basis of that previous article. My boss approached me over the phone. She said that the article about youth in the sex trade represented, and I quote, a public health approach. I was fired about a week after publicly complaining about this and also about the sexual harassment of lesbians by men claiming to be lesbians. I didn't know it was possible to be fired for complaining to a social justice nonprofit about people whitewashing child sex trafficking, but I sure found out. And I felt, and I still feel, very deeply betrayed, especially because I could roll out another dozen examples of this language being pushed by everyone from AIDS advocacy communities to allegedly feminist media sites, claiming that this is human rights. This is feminism to whitewash the commercial sexual exploitation of children. So there's a guy out there right now who is looking for that kid who got dropped by their family or dropped by the foster care system, or they're just so hurt and angry that they can't let anyone help them. And he's gonna offer to buy them something they want. And it's possible that the only thing that might save them in that moment is a sense that something's not right, a sense of fear, something that tells them, walk away now, right now. And are they gonna have that fear if they've been watching violent porn since they were 11? If their peers have been watching it, if it's been normalized to them that this is just what you do, this is just another job. It's common that if an adult is trafficked for sexual exploitation, they started as a minor and their first pimp passed himself off as a boyfriend. It should never be acceptable. It should never happen. It should not be politically acceptable under any circumstances to give that cover. Thank you.
My name is Georgia Kijesky. With the Personhood Alliance, founder Personhood Maryland. Personhood Alliance is, just to summarize in case you haven't heard about it, it is a confederation of independent pro-life organizations who pursue personhood as the essential strategy for restoring legal protection to every human being from womb to tomb, without exception, and who work to uphold the biblical worldview by honoring God's design for life, marriage, family, sexuality, and gender. I'm just a homeschool mom. I was sitting home one day reading my newspaper, and I stumble upon this advertisement for a sex ed class for minors only. So upon further research, I find that the instructor is a sex toy lubricant peddling BDSM instructor. And this is being hosted by my library, co-hosted by the lubricant company she works for. So, of course, that wasn't advertised by the library. That was some deep digging on my part to find that information out. And upon inquiring with my library board, with all the people that work at the library, they were perfectly fine with her public appearance, persona, as an expert in the field of sex for children. So, long story short, the class was originally canceled by public backlash. However, meeting room loopholes and obscenity exemption laws permitted the class to go on despite public backlash. And it was held police protection. The police set up a security checkpoint so adults wouldn't enter the room. Actually arrested a woman who tried. So that was my first run-in with the library, and then fast forward a couple months later to another sounding of the alarm to a book display that was luring children to read sexually explicit material. These books were covered with brown paper bags, neon labels up front that read, "Read the book, you rebel, you." You lift the bag and you find Little Black Book for Girls. And I hate to have to bring this stuff up, but inside the book, when you look, is pictures of sex toys and how to place dental dams in areas and how to basically making it seem like this is all fun and this is encouraging children to engage in this behavior. Then this led me to the understanding, after this is now 9 months of grappling with my library, what is going on here? Who's running the show? Why is this being allowed to happen? And come to find that our library is being controlled by the Library Board of Trustees under the appearance that the taxpaying citizen is running the library they're funding. But this is not the case. The library trustees are appointing themselves, giving the impression that the taxpayer has control of the library they fund by handing over their suggested trustees to our library officials and allowing them to appoint themselves. So this went to the state level to try to get this law amended. This is all protected under the law that they can do this. And long story short, our GOP elected officials caved to the ALA pressure. And the amendment never even saw the light of day. All it was to rein in the library so that the taxpayers could have control who funds them. We don't want these books being hurled upon children. We don't want the sexual grooming of children in our libraries. And we should have a say in that, and we don't. But that's the little secret that the ALA does not want you all to know. So I am going to just pause here for a moment to allow my own librarian to speak. She's not here, of course, but she wrote this article back in June 2017, the month after my first encounter, the sex ed class for minors only. Do you work for a library in a small, rural, conservative community and wish you could do more to make your library more inclusive to LGBTQ community but meet with resistance? There are steps you can take to move your library and community progressively forward, and here are a few things I've done. Tips and tricks to being a secret librarian operative. Sure, you want to eventually get Drag Queen Story Hour, but start with something simple. Now, this article was directed towards librarians nationwide. Like I said, your library isn't ready for Drag Queen Story Hour, but that doesn't mean those programs can't still be held in your library. If your library has meeting space, reach out to groups like your local PFLAG group and let them know they can hold meetings and host programs at your library. sneakily fit stuff into current programs. So you're not doing drag queen story time yet, but you're probably doing just regular old story time, right? Try to sneak inclusive messages into your current programs. For instance, if you're reading a book about a mama bear and a papa bear, say it's about two papa bears. If there are characters in a book where gender is unidentified and irrelevant, feel free to play and change it up. Chances are families won't even notice. Creatively encourage inclusive collection development. If your library is resistant to letting you do a display or a program, purchase materials with LGBT themes. So this is where I found out, okay, these books that are on the shelves are actually being requested by librarians. Request the books, movies, and music. This will help you. Keep advocating, my fellow small-town librarians. Despite adversity, it's worth it, she closes her article. Of course, this was all meant to be a secret. This was not meant for us, tax-paying citizens, menial, busy, raising our families to find out about. So it's really important to realize, now this is leading up to my 2019 experience with the Drag Queen Story Hour in my library. And what exactly is it? I mean, let's call it what it is. It's cross-dressers, mostly biological men dressed up, not just like women, but a cartoon caricature of women. Women should be outraged. We're the feminists around. You know, so this is like blackface, I heard someone refer to this as. This is very true. I mean, it's a grotesque, you know, making women look grotesque. It certainly doesn't make me feel pretty, I'll tell you. It's really, the whole goal is to push this homosexual, sexually deviant gender ideology. Storytime is not just storytime at my library. It was dress kids into drag, teach them how to cross-dress, do their makeup, get them dressed up. And, you know, they're tailored precisely to entice children to question the reality of human sexuality. It's to normalize abnormal behavior as early as possible. And why exactly is this bad for children? Well, it exposes them to adult themes. Cross-dressers are adult entertainers. The one at my library just so happens to be running I guess you could call it a adult escort service on his spare time. Reports of children crawling on cross-dressers. This is, I don't know if you saw the pictures out there of the little children crawling all over one of the cross-dressers. Reports of storytime cross-dressers as being registered child sex offender. This was in Texas. Fox News reported on that as well. This confuses children and it frustrates human nature. It disrupts relationships, and it's really harmful to society. Dr. Michelle Cretella, president of the American College of Pediatricians, she states, children will come to believe that their sex is whatever they think they want it to be. This is dangerous from a psychological point of view. It's disrupting the natural process of gender identity formation. So what can we do? What can we do as parents, just sitting home, you know, trying to raise our families and live a good, decent life? Well, we have to find out where exactly our libraries are being controlled from. Who's controlling them? For me, it took months to find out that our libraries are not being controlled by us who are paying for them. You can make Drag Queen Story Hour or any type of sexualization of children an electoral measure within your community. We must get libraries out of the hands of the ALA. That is really where this is at. People are completely unaware that the ALA is behind all this. And we have to do that. And one good way to do that would be to repurpose our libraries into community centers, right? Our libraries we're in a post-library age. Technology, my library director said, we're no longer a warehouse of books. Right now, they're doing yoga, 3D printers, and they are catering to the homeless. They are giving them toiletries and turning the meeting rooms into cafeterias for the homeless. So I would basically say to you have to keep the pressure on. We can't sit around and just hope that somebody else will do this for us. We really have to take a stand. And that's basically my conclusion here.
Yeah. Well, these have been harrowing, sobering, enlightening, and absolutely necessary testimonies that we've heard this morning to kick off this event. But as dark as the subject matter is, it's also inspiring that they have women like the ones to my left here that are doing this work on the policy level, on the opinion leading level, and on the community level. If we all do work together, and the Heritage Foundation is not only doing this one event as a one-time deal, we want to walk alongside everybody who's come here today to talk about these issues, to make sure that we can make a real difference and to stop the exploitation of children. So I'd like to thank the panel, and then we'll move on to the next panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you to all the panelists for your work and your presentations. They were very powerful. And we know that it's not only sexualized, children are not only being sexualized in the culture, but increasingly in the classroom. And so I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker, Rebecca Friedrichs. She is a 28-year-old veteran elementary school teacher from California who fought the teachers union there all the way up to the Supreme Court, because the union was forcing teachers like her to pay dues in support of causes that they didn't believe in and that they objected to. Her case was called Friedrichs versus California Teachers Association. One of the causes the union promoted was comprehensive sexuality education. And throughout her battle against the union, Rebecca faced intense pressure to quit. But she and her colleagues are passionate about kids, and so they persevered. Ultimately, their cause was vindicated in a subsequent Supreme Court case, Janus versus American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. That verdict freed government employees around the country from having to pay union dues to support causes that violated their consciences. And Rebecca has now founded an organization called For Kids and Country, which provides parents with resources on comprehensive sexuality education and guidance on how to take control of their children's education. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Friedrichs.
Good morning, everyone. Well, the first thing I want to mention to you this morning is that when you hear that teachers are behind comprehensive sexuality education, or that teachers agree with the sexualization of children, that's a huge deception. So I'm here to speak out for America's real teachers today. America's real teachers are deeply disturbed by the sexualization of our children. And it is over-sexualization, and it is happening in America's schools. But America's real teachers have been silenced and bullied by the very organization that is pushing the sexualization of children, that is, labor unions. And these labor unions have silenced teachers for about 60 years. They've collected billions from us annually, tax-free, to push their sexual, social, and political agenda into our classrooms and onto our country. They claim to represent teachers, but they have bullied us and silenced us. And I will show you some examples of that this morning. The teachers' unions have actually I think for the rest of the morning I will not refer to them as teachers' unions. They do not deserve that respect or honor. They don't even really deserve the honor of unions, but we will call them unions who masquerade as teachers and masquerade as experts. They are neither. So these unions have literally been attacking the very virtues that teachers cherish. The National Education Association was originally started by teachers like myself in the 1800s. Why did they start it? To help children better learn Judeo-Christian virtues. I don't have time to show you the evidence today, but I have little booklets that they created that were actually full of prayers and scripture and stories of heroism and courage, Judeo-Christian virtues. And the teachers' unions, the unions, came in and undermined it all. They have used the teaching profession to gain unfettered access to America's children. So when you hear teachers support this, please say, no, that's a lie. Union activists masquerading as teachers support this. Real teachers are horrified. They agree with you, parents. Do not allow unions to divide us any longer. They've been dividing parents and teachers for decades. Let's stop that today. So during my career, I was a teacher in California for 28 years. The only reason I'm not in the classroom today with my precious little students whom I miss so much it hurts is because I'm fighting this battle. Because if someone doesn't fight it for teachers and kids, it's going to continue. So during my career, because I couldn't make my voice heard, I started fighting from within the union, thinking none of my teacher friends agree with this whole nightmare, so maybe we can stop it from the inside. Well, it didn't go very well, as you can imagine. But I witnessed a lot that helped me to understand what's going on, and it made me a better plaintiff when we brought our case against the unions. Here's what I witnessed. I would go to state-level teacher conferences. I never saw anything that had anything to do with a labor union representing teachers. I never saw anything that had to do with being a great teacher. When I tried to get help for my special ed students, I could get no help. Here's what I saw. Rooms full of expo tables that were pushing Planned Parenthood, gay straight alliance clubs, all kinds of rainbow, just everything you can think of that has to do with LGBT advocacy or far left politics. I witnessed as teachers were wined and dined, and if you agreed to start a gay straight alliance on your campus, you can get big money. You can also get big money to push LGBT activism in the classroom. But can you get money to actually do something to help your students? No. Can you get support as a union leader for your colleagues? No. But you can get all kinds of help for LGBTQ activism. You can also attend wild parties at all of these union events full of all kinds of very expensive alcohol and food off the backs of middle-class teachers who have no idea they're funding this. I read business items. I have read thousands of business items passed by teachers' unions. I said it again. They're not teachers' unions. By unions, none of them. Well, maybe 2 or 3 would have to do with children, but they're labor unions. So their business items shouldn't have anything to do with children. They should have to do with labor. So most of their business items are about far left politics, LGBT agenda, divisive narratives. Every divisive word you hear or see in our culture was first mentioned, made up inside the unions. At NEA representative assemblies, I have teacher friends who have been fighting against the over-sexualization of our children for over 30 years. Over 30 years. Here's how they've been treated. They would go into, up to the podium to speak against the over-sexualization of children or just to ask for balance in the curriculum. My friends have been spit upon. They have been screamed at. Screamed while they're speaking screamed at while they're speaking on the podium. Their way has been blocked when they try to get back to their seat. They have been barred from serving on sex ed and health committees, and they have literally 2 of my friends were told there's a special place in hell for people like you. This is how America's loving teachers are treated by labor unions. This summer, my teacher friends, who still go to every NEA representative assembly as retired teachers, and some of them still serve inside, even though they're beat up. This is a quote that one of them sent to me, that they went to the NEA event, and there was a drag queen event, which used 3 ballrooms. Teachers paid for this. Here's the quote. The drag queen show began with a huge, muscular man in a sequin vest over a bare chest, belting out descriptions and positions of masturbation. There were little children and even a baby in the room. And this is how they entertained teachers. What they're doing is trying to indoctrinate teachers and tell teachers this is normal behavior and you should push this. These are the people who are pushing this sexual agenda, not loving teachers. One precious teacher told me that during her new teacher workshops, she was forced to share intimate sexual details of her life. When she shared that she is a virgin because she is not married and she is a Christian, they laughed at her and shamed her. So teachers are bullied on every level, and we are horrified at the instruction we are being told to teach to your children. Here are just a few examples. We're told to teach children of their sexual rights, that they should have pleasure at all ages, sexual pleasure. That out of wedlock sex with anyone you want is just fine from any age. And hey, you shouldn't think you're not bisexual or homosexual. Don't knock it till you try it. We are told that the #1 goal that we are to teach children is to prevent pregnancy. Think about that. It's not to hold off until marriage. We're not to teach them that, oh, you can get a lot of diseases if you're sleeping around. No, it's don't get pregnant. Just prevent pregnancy. And forgive me for telling you this, but we are told to teach children how to use condoms by bringing in fully erect penis models for them to manipulate, 10 and 11-year-olds. All of this has to be done in mixed company because we are told to tell the children as young as 4, your parents didn't know your gender when you were born, so they assigned you a gender. There's really a huge spectrum, ever-growing spectrum of genders. You will figure out your gender someday. That, I'll say it, is child abuse. It's also the abuse of parents. It's also religious abuse. Thank you. And one last highlight, we are told we have to tell children how and where to obtain birth control, including the morning after pill and abortion, without parental knowledge or permission from age 12. The details are so inappropriate that I cannot even mention them to you today. I've been asked not to say these things, but they're being said to our children in America's schools. That is evil. I have 3 chapters in my book, Standing Up to Goliath, if you'd like some more details. Now, the unions and their friends knew that teachers would never, ever teach this. So they've written into the laws that if teachers are unqualified, then the experts will come in and teach it, and Planned Parenthood will abuse your children. I would like to assert today that Planned Parenthood is not the expert on children. Neither are any of these other people pushing an agenda. Parents are the experts on their children. So teachers and families are in crisis. And I want to share with you a few highlights on a PowerPoint of how the unions have done this, how they have undermined parents and teachers. Before I show that, just a couple highlights. In 1960s, the National Education Association bullied the PTA so severely that the PTA took a stance of neutrality. Ever since the 60s, the PTA has not been allowed to take a stance opposite of the teachers' unions. So that's why they support everything the unions tell them to support. And I have a quote in my book of a union leader saying, we use the PTA as a front. The unions have taken over the Librarians Association, they have taken over the School Boards Association, they have taken over every angle of our schools. So the unions are the real existential threat. They have silenced teachers, and they do it by using deceit, intimidation, and massive power. Let me just show you a few slides. So the National Education Association adopted this amendment to science education. They basically obliterated the scientific method. So they said that the NEA believes that the content in science education must be based on, you can see in yellow, that's what they crossed out. These are their strikeouts. They struck out empirical evidence derived from valid scientific experimentation. And they changed it to what I've highlighted for you in green and what they underscored. Scientific theory that incorporates empirically collected, well, you can see it yourself. The entire process leads towards scientific consensus. And then they bully and shun anyone who doesn't agree with their consensus. This is how they undermine science. Then they bully teachers like myself by saying that they will not accept exhibitors whose messaging is in conflict with those changes. And then my teacher friends who started an NEA ex-gay educators caucus because the unions bully ex-gays. They bully them heavily. Shame on them. And they bully Christians. Their real goal is to remove our Judeo-Christian virtues. So you can see from this one, I'm going to use a little pointer, that if you dare to bring in information on creation truth or ex-gays, you are considered offensive, obscene, and in bad taste. That's how the unions feel about us. The unions passed a sex education resolution. I'm not showing you all of it. You can feel free to take pictures. But I want you to note this part, that teachers and health professionals must be qualified to teach in this area and must be legally protected from censorship and lawsuits. Why? Because we all want to sue them and silence them. How do they enforce this? Well, the National Education Association works in partnership with the Southern Poverty Law Center, NAACP, ACLU, Gelson, all these human rights, all of them, blah, 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 to, there's the words, homophobia, transphobia. They're going to track all incidences of all this, and they are going to eradicate hate. We've all seen the hate map. It's loaded with Christian organizations, conservative organizations. So they're going to eradicate us. And the frightening thing is that when parents and teachers and school boards push back, it's the ACLU that comes in and says, we're going to sue you. Here is a toolkit that Southern Poverty Law Center and ACLU and others, Gelson, helped the teachers' unions create. This toolkit is pages and pages. You can find it on the CTA website. Children can actually report their classmates and teachers to the Southern Poverty Law Center as haters. There are direct links to SPLC. It's Orwellian. These are just some posters that teachers can hang in their classrooms. The one I'd like to point out the most to you is this one, because it'll help you to understand that the sex ed is not the only problem unions are pushing. Every single divisive narrative in this country is pushed, funded, organized by the unions. If you're being bullied and people are screaming at you, and especially if they're screaming the F word at you, you can bet the unions organized it with my money. But if you'll look at this poster, it says Black Lives Matter. It says women's rights are human rights. No human is illegal. Science is real. Love is love. Kindness is everything. It means exactly the opposite of what it says. Okay, so there we go. Teachers' unions used my money to pass transgender bathrooms and locker rooms. I don't know one teacher or parent that agrees with this, but want to point out to you that they are bragging that they were able to get transgender students into the restrooms and locker rooms of their choice, and that this was supported by teacher and parent organizations, including the California PTA and the California Teachers Association. Why would the PTA support that? Because they don't. They've been silenced. This is a magazine that I was forced to fund for 28 years. California Educator, you can see that we're embracing the spectrum of genders and learning the new pronouns. Teachers are now losing their jobs if they don't use the pronouns. Bless this child. This is a little boy who feels that he is a girl. And so they highlight Lily's story, and Lily is, has a spectrum of genders. This is what the unions really do with teacher money. So I'd like to state that the unions are 100% out of their jurisdiction. Their jurisdiction is to be labor unions. If you are a policy person in this room today, would you please help me to end government unions? They do not belong in our government or our schools or anywhere that's taxpayer funded. They are destroying academic rigor, excellence, science, and they are purposely undermining Judeo-Christian virtues, American virtues, which are essential for a free republic. So I've been asked today to share with you what gave me the courage to fight, to take the case to the Supreme Court. Well, I was voiceless. I fought within the school system for 28 years and could get nowhere. Children, families, and teachers were being harmed continually. And it was God. One day, God just laid it on my heart to start writing editorials to expose this nightmare. And I was afraid. I wasn't afraid to write or tell my story, but I was afraid of newspapers rejecting me. And so the Lord led me to the widow's mite. And he told me, well, I'll tell you the story. The widow's mite, I think it's 2 verses. This widow puts 2 mites in the offering. It's like 2 pennies. And Jesus points her out to his disciples and says, that woman just gave more than all the wealthy because she gave in her faith. She gave from nothing. And so he just laid on my heart, just give me what you got, girl. I'll do the rest. Newspapers are my problem. So I did. And within 6 months of my first editorial, I was lead plaintiff in a national lawsuit suing the people I just wanted to expose in the Orange County Register. And today I have a piece in foxnews.com. I hope you'll read it. I've also been asked to give advice to parents and others on what you should do if you're afraid or if you're not sure how to fight the battle. So my advice is give what you've got. God will do the rest. Live what you believe. Do you believe in the golden rule? Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you? Would you want someone sexualizing you as a child? Would you want to be a teacher who's bullied every day and can't teach anymore? Stand up. Follow the golden rule. And remember, they called us David versus Goliath in our case, and that gave me a lot of courage. Why? David won. You got it. So if you're feeling like David, get your 5 smooth stones and start hurling them. Last thing I'd just like to share with you is this Adopt a Teacher flyer. Our organization just created Adopt a Teacher. It's our way of saying, please, would you help us? Everyone knows a teacher, especially teachers in your churches or your synagogues. Put your arm around them, love them, hand them a copy of our book, Standing Up to Goliath. We wrote it to expose the deceits of the union and to help teachers to stop this nightmare. Teachers do not know that they are funding this nightmare. They have no idea. And if they just stopped, because they were forced for 50 years, they're not forced anymore, but they don't know that either. Help us educate them. Our schools are on fire. Our kids are inside. Unions are the flames. Teachers have no idea. So let's get teachers out of unions. Let's get unions out of our schools. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today, and thank you to Emilie for putting on this great event. And thanks to Rebecca Friedrichs. That was a fantastic setup and a bridge between what we heard in the first panel and implications for education policy and what's taught in schools across the country today. I'm Lindsay Burke. I direct the Center for Education Policy here at Heritage, and it's my pleasure to host this panel and moderate what promises to be a great conversation. Parents, we would all agree, are a child's first and foremost educators, full stop. Schools should never impede or supersede the desires of parents and should instead act as partners during those hours of the day in which children are in their care, working carefully to reinforce parental values while providing students a solid grounding in things like traditional civics and ensuring they leave literate and numerate. On this point about reinforcing the values of parents, this is why choice in education is so critical, so that families can select into education environments that best reflect their vision of the morals and character development and values, their hopes and dreams and aspirations for their children long term. School choice is an indispensable component of protecting parental rights. But public schools, in which, when we include charter schools, educate today still 90% of all students, must also be partners with parents in the education of the next generation of Americans and the formation of future adults. Because the vast majority of students still attend public schools, conservatives must engage in this critical conversation about the content that is taught within the four walls of the 100,000 plus public schools across the country. If we do not, groups like, and I should say special interest groups, I'll try to avoid teachers' unions per Rebecca Friedrichs' admonition, but groups like the National Education Association and the American Federation for Children will further control that narrative. Take, for example, a recent resolution passed by the NEA this year. Delegates to the union's annual conference passed a business item stating that, quote, the NEA vigorously opposes all attacks on the right to choose and stands on the fundamental right to abortion under Roe v. Wade. If we think about that in the context of the outcomes that we see in schools across the country today, we see a pretty stark contrast. We're still at a point where just a third of all students today, of all children, can read proficiently and do math proficiently, and yet the NEA's focus at its national convention is on upholding this so-called fundamental right to abortion. So this is why we're here today. We have an excellent panel to discuss and better understand the current state of affairs in schools today with regard to things like comprehensive sex education, sexual orientation, and gender identity, and the tools available to parents and teachers when it comes to these most sensitive issues. So we'll hear from a few excellent panelists today about their experiences. First, we will hear from Stephanie Curry, who is an attorney with the Family Policy Alliance. Then we'll hear from Derek Max, who is the executive director and principal of Cornerstone Schools of Washington, D.C. Next, we'll hear from Emilie Zenos, who is a parent activist, the project coordinator for Ask Me First Minnesota, a member of the Hands Across the Aisle Coalition, and author of the National Parent Resource Guide published by the Minnesota Family Policy Council. And finally, we will hear from Bernadette Broyles, who is president and general counsel for the Child and Parental Rights Campaign. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. All right, Stephanie.
Okay, hi, good morning. I'm Stephanie Curry, and I was asked to just give a brief summary and overview of SOGI policy and comprehensive sex ed, and just to quickly cover the nuts and bolts of those. So SOGI policy is sexual orientation and gender identity policy, and it deals with adding the words sexual orientation and gender identity into state civil rights statutes and the federal civil rights statute. And that is referred to as the Equality Act, which I'm sure you've all heard of. So the reason why we say SOGI and not LGBT+ is because we can't possibly fit the thousands of gender identities and sexual orientations into the law. So SOGI covers all of it, but it's really about adding that language into civil rights codes. So there's been lots of SOGIs introduced in states across the country, the vast majority of them fail, but the Federal Equality Act is getting a lot of attention for some really good reasons. So what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does is I'm sure we're all familiar, is it has formed protected classes of people based upon race, religion, sex, national origin, etc., and for very good reason. We know the history of what has happened and why we need protected classes in America, particularly for race. And so to add on sexual orientation and gender identity right next to the words race would really result in giving special rights to LGBT identifying people. And just like Rebecca was saying, teacher unions, they've kind of redefined teacher unions. LGBT identifying people have redefined what it means, discrimination means. And I had the wonderful opportunity to visit the African American New History and Cultural Museum here in DC yesterday. My Uber driver said it was phenomenal, so I had some time, so I skipped over there, and really it was phenomenal, and I didn't even see half of it. But it really helped to remind me of what discrimination means. It's a very powerful word and how it has been so twisted today, where the discrimination that Blacks' experience in this country was widespread, it was pervasive, it was persistent, it was abusive, of course, and it was in cooperation with the state, the church, private groups, companies, and businesses with the intent to create a second class. It was dehumanizing and abusive, and that is not at all what the LGBT identifying people have experienced. It is not comparable. So that is one reason why we absolutely are against the use of discrimination in that way, because these SOGIs by the left are often referred to as non-discrimination bills. You may have heard them say non-discrimination bills. We just need this as a shield to protect us from discrimination. The 1964 Civil Rights Act was in fact a shield and has worked very well. But what we see is LGBT identifying people using SOGI laws as a sword to reach into the homes, private businesses, churches, religious organizations of all private citizens. It doesn't just regulate the behavior of the government, which is what the Civil Rights Act does. And so we're seeing, the Civil Rights Act talks about desegregation of public facilities, desegregation of public education, and we're adding in LGBT, sexual orientation, and gender identity into those aspects of the code. That is how widespread this is. So if the Equality Act were to pass, what would happen is it would define pretty much any activity that you can think of, all these issues that we've been talking about today. We would lose quite a bit of ground. It would be very hard to reverse the clock. So it would possibly mandate that comprehensive sex ed is taught in schools. It would require that boys are in girls' locker rooms and bathrooms. We would require that LGBT curriculum is taught in all subjects, not just comprehensive sex ed, because you're discriminating if you're not addressing it. It would require insurance coverage of gender transition services. It would require religious organizations and churches to hire people who are not living out their faith-based values and principles. So it's very wide-reaching, and I would love to discuss it more. If you're interested, reach out to me. And just in a nutshell, comprehensive sex ed, I think we'll be talking a lot more about that, but just some of the legal aspects of comprehensive sex ed and some trigger words you'll see when you're reading it is things like medically accurate, which does not mean what you think it means. Medically accurate, rights-based sexuality, as was mentioned before, that your child has the right to sex from birth. And I actually have a handout on the table over there on the table outside, which does include some egregious examples of comprehensive sex ed, and it does include what exactly their mission is, and that Planned Parenthood is the biggest writer and distributor of comprehensive sex ed. Why, you may ask? Get this, and please read it so you know the extent of their involvement in comprehensive sex ed. Also, consent education and just teaching your children that yes means yes, they can consent, they can do whatever feels right. And what does that mean when you're teaching a 9-year-old that? In this example, there's things like you can bathe with your friends at the age of 6. You can engage in mutual touching of one another. That's safe. It's teaching your children to say yes to what they think feels pleasurable and good, but it doesn't protect them from pedophiles. It doesn't tell them what criminal activity, sexual activity is. It's getting them used to, it's grooming basically, and it's in our classrooms. And so this goes over some of the more egregious aspects of comprehensive sex ed. And it also teaches abortion, abortifacients, of course the explicit sexual experiences of LGBT people. Some of the content we're seeing is flat out pornographic. It cannot be described in any other way. It is exposing our children to pornography and should not be in our classrooms.
Great, thank you. So, Derek, as a school leader.
Sure. Thank you, Lindsay and Heritage, for having me. I really can't think of a more important issue for our time, and one that so many of us are afraid to talk about, which is why I'm glad to be here and unafraid, as I think we all should be. Cornerstone is a private Christian school. You'd think we would be immune from this debate and these struggles. We serve low-income students east of the river here in Southeast. We have 184 students, kindergarten to the 12th grade. I think the main reason I'm here is to share a little bit of a story about how the movement on gender identity and sexual orientation has reached even to our little school. 18 months ago, we were holding an accreditation meeting. We accept students that get the DC voucher, which is it's a voucher that goes to parents that allows them to choose any school that they want. There was a law passed that required schools receiving the voucher to get accreditation, which I was opposed to. So we had our first meeting with an accrediting agency. They came in. Now understand, I'm in a part of DC that is very violent. In my 5 years there, I've seen 3 dead bodies. We have students that are behind. We probably only have 8 or 10 families that have a birth mother and a birth father in the home together. So there's a lot of issues that I would think would come up in an accreditation meeting. To find out how we're educating these students. And the first question that I was asked was by the accreditors, what am I doing to get more non-Christians on my board? I explained to them nothing. We expect our board to fully support our mission and our values, which is to prepare students for life here on earth and for life eternal. Pretty simple. His second question to me, and now I understand this meeting lasted an hour and a half, so I'm abbreviating. His second question to me is, what are we doing to support same-sex attracted students? I said we are teaching them that marriage is between a man and a woman. Sex of any kind should be in marriage. And for the most part, we are praying and hoping and fighting with our children to withhold any sexual activity until they're out of college and married and ready to handle this loaded gun. The next question, again, I'm at this point I am baffled at how the meeting is going and worried about my accreditation. His next question to me is, what are we doing to support transitioning students? In particular, what is our bathroom policy? I said we teach students that they were created wonderfully and beautifully by God as men and as women. And that is a beautiful thing, and we support them in that. Obviously, this conversation went a little bit longer and a little more complex, but I can tell you at this point I did not want to be accredited at all, and I definitely did not want to be accredited by this group. They left. I called a few people in shock because you ever have like where you think bad things can happen, but you think maybe you're being paranoid, and then they happen, and so I was in shock. About 2 hours later, they called back, and they said, hey, we forgot to ask one question. Now understand, they didn't ask me anything about how we're keeping students safe. They didn't ask anything about how we're individualizing education for students that are behind. They didn't ask anything about racial issues that surely are a big part of what we do. So I was thinking, here's where he's going to ask me something sensible. And he said, what are you doing to teach evolution? And I said, well, surely we teach evolution as a theory. We have a good science curriculum. And he said, well, I just want to make sure that you're providing a liberal education to your students. So I said, sir, have you called all your non-Christian schools and asked if they're teaching creation? His answer was no, and then he laughed and he said, but that's a good point. I really want to get across here that schools are they're not a place for social experiments. Our students are behind in reading, writing, arithmetic, science. Our students in particular are struggling. They're struggling mightily in academics. We need to jealously protect a culture that allows them to learn. And I can tell you the number one thing that allows students to learn is that they feel safe and they feel secure and they understand who they are. I can tell you that, and the last panel discussed it, the electronic abuse of our children, it's astronomical. It's having a gigantic effect. We do everything we can to lock down our computers. We do not allow cell phones in the school. We take them if we see them, and yet our students are constantly becoming addicted to images and activities that will harm them for a lifetime. I can tell you a story of a mother that brought her son in by the ear. No father in the home, so I was going to be the man to talk to him. And she said to the young man, "Tell Mr. Mack what you've been doing." The young man said to me, "I've been sending pictures of myself to other men on the internet." I turned to the mom, I said, "The first thing you need to know is your son is not broken. He has an addiction." I said, "The second thing you need to know is that God can heal him." But then I turned to the young man and I said, "Can you remember the first pornographic image you ever looked at?" And he said, "Yes." And he admitted it had been 4 or 5 years. I said to him, "Can you remember what you looked at last night?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "How different were they?" And he broke down crying, knowing that the evolution or the devolution of what he was involved in was great. I can tell you that sex education and the desire to get our kids an education at younger and younger ages is dangerous. It is outside the scope, and ultimately it drives the education literally to the lowest common denominator. An education that asks students to question their identity and their orientation only creates greater confusion. Our students need to know who they are. They need to be comfortable in who they are, and I can tell you, our students have a hard time understanding so much about their lives and so much about what they do. I can tell you a young lady that, again, no father, 4th grade, you would think 4th grade is young age, who we found in the bathroom video chatting with a 45-year-old man. This is a woman a young girl that just wanted to be loved. If you put an education on that student that encourages them to explore, encourages them to question, you will do permanent damage to those students. I give you kind of an odd example, but we have all kinds of alternative lifestyles in our school. One is diabetes. Those students will live an alternate lifestyle their entire life. They will take insulin, they will leave the classroom, they will have all kinds of things that they will have to do that is just different than the rest of the students. We do not teach the entire school about diabetes. We do not even teach her entire class about diabetes. Because what would happen is every student in that class would wonder every time they felt thirsty or had to go to the bathroom a few extra times, do I have diabetes? And of course the answer, were we to do that, would be no. We would even lie to them and say, "You're not a diabetic, you will never be a diabetic," to get them to not worry. The truth is, and the kind of education we're talking about on sexual orientation and gender identity, when they ask, "Am I maybe in the wrong body?" my guess is the people that are teaching this kind of stuff are saying you might be. And it's just adding to the confusion, the misunderstanding, and a lifetime really of anxiety. And it's just wrong. So I just want you to know it's everywhere, it's pervasive, and people are afraid to speak up. It will only get worse. I recently had a colleague tell me about a work colleague who was trans species. He identifies as a walrus. I can tell you infantilism, people who identify as children, is growing. I don't know where this stops, but I got to tell you, we must return. The Bible is very specific about the father of confusion and chaos. And I don't think this is by accident. I don't think it's an accident that our libraries are being taken over. I don't think it's an accident that our schools are being taken over. I think it is by design to get students to deny their creation and how they were created so that they will deny their creator. And if we don't stand up and be willing to say, "No, I actually believe you are a man, and I actually believe you are a woman, and I believe your marriage should be between a man and a woman for a lifetime," we will lose this debate, and we will lose our kids. And in 10 years, if the next 10 years are anything like the last 5 years, we are all in trouble. Thank you.
Emilie.
Thank you. I hope I can speak to some of the multi-partisan concerns with this issue today in my remarks. 4 years ago, I received an email that changed my life. My children's public school principal sent out a message to the parent community explaining that a gender nonconforming child had enrolled in kindergarten. A couple months later, his parents announced that their son was really their daughter. And what followed were demands to institutionalize gender identity ideology under the guise of bullying prevention. Transgender propaganda books like My Princess Boy and I Am Jazz had to be read to the youngest students without parental notification or permission. Girls' restrooms had to be transformed from places meant to serve bodily needs into places that were meant to substantiate a chosen identity. And frightened kindergartners started asking their parents if they too would suddenly become the opposite sex. The real bully at our school went by the name of gender, and every single student was its victim. Within a political environment that painted the simple acknowledgement of human sex in the ominous shades of invidious discrimination, our school board made the wrong choice and adopted what's called a gender inclusion policy. In a tragic irony, these policies, pushed by wealthy national LGBT activist organizations, place transgender-identified students at particular risk for needless, irreversible medical interventions. I didn't know that 4 years ago, but I do now, and that's why I'm here today. I stuck out my neck on this issue after I discovered that there are 13-year-old girls who are undergoing double mastectomies. 100% of the kids prescribed puberty blockers are later chemically sterilized. And why? The adults in their lives have convinced them that they're trapped in the wrong body. Our public schools have no business perpetuating that dangerous idea. Here's the bottom line. Gender inclusion policies not only eradicate bodily privacy protections and girls' sports opportunities, they further require that school staff allow students to change their name and appearance to that of the opposite sex. That's known as social transition. This is not a neutral step. Studies have connected social transition with the persistence of transgender identification, meaning that schools with gender inclusion policies are naively feeding the most vulnerable kids into a school-to-gender clinic pipeline, and it's trans-identified kids that will get hurt. It's only those schools who refuse to capitulate to gender identity ideology in language, policy, or practice that will be safe places for young people today. I believe that it's parents, not outside activists, who need to make public schools aware of the role that gender inclusion policies play in encouraging irreversible medical harm. Can we have the first slide? First slide, please. Okay. As the project coordinator for Ask Me First Minnesota, I worked with organizations and experts from across the political spectrum to create the new Parent Resource Guide. It offers an overview of the consequences of the transgender issue on child health and education. It was learning the consequences of gender affirmation that motivated me to speak out. I hope that this guide will lead many more moms and dads to do the same. The Parent Resource Guide came to be with help from 5 different supporting organizations, including the support of Minnesota Family Council. They've all played a role in educating the public on this issue from a diversity of viewpoints. The Heritage Foundation and Family Policy Alliance have both engaged in significant efforts to make the public aware of the ramifications of gender identity laws. The apolitical Kelsey Coalition and Parents of ROGD Kids offer advocacy and support to families with trans-identifying children. And Women's Liberation Front is the only feminist organization in this country laboring to expose the negative effects of gender identity ideology on women and girls. As a multi-partisan, collaborative effort, the Parent Resource Guide represents 60 pages of agreement that right, left, and center share on this issue. Public schools are for all kids. no matter what their family's religious or political convictions are. And likewise, the Parent Resource Guide is for all families. Here's what you'll find inside. We have endorsements from an amazing variety of people, including Miriam Ben Shalom, a Jewish lesbian civil rights activist, Walt Heyer, who's dedicated his life to helping detransitioners like himself, and Dr. Susan Bradley, a child psychiatrist who founded a world-renowned pediatric gender clinic in Toronto. We include a glossary that defines terms as they're being used in this debate, answers to a wide range of frequently asked questions, colorful fast facts pages that shed light on the consequences to child health in sports, testimonials from parents of trans-identified kids and detransitioners, and a list of key questions that parents should ask of their school officials, along with letter templates that parents can use to request notification and opt out. The Parent Resource Guide will help parents to discover what their school is already presenting in the classroom and to react confidently with reasonable solutions. But the goal here wasn't just to prepare parents to react. Trans activist organizations have long trained parents to instigate policy change. It's time that we stopped simply reacting to bad curricula and policy. The Parent Resource Guide will make it possible for parents to step forward proactively with constructive ideas to ensure a truly safe and inclusive community. I'd like to encourage everyone to download the Parent Resource Guide for free at genderresourceguide.com. You can also purchase printed guides at that website. As a mom of 7, soon to be 8, I'm not afraid to raise my voice. I do it a lot. And here's what our schools need to hear. Many young kids who are identifying as trans today will grow up to be same-sex attracted. Since when does same-sex attraction call for chemical sterilization and the removal of genitalia? A disproportionate number of children referred to gender clinics have already been diagnosed with ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, or severe depression or anxiety. I'm not afraid to tell it like it is. Sex reassignment procedures performed on mentally vulnerable young people is eugenics 2.0. Girls now far outnumber boys at gender clinics. I won't keep quiet. This is big pharma capitalizing on the insecurities of adolescent girls in an overly sexualized culture. This is an emergency. Our culture may be blind to it now, but at some point in the future, no one will be able to deny the destruction that results from pitting a child against his or her own body. Will you wait until then to say, I always thought child transition was a bad idea? Or can you muster the courage now, while we still have the chance to prevent these terrible ideas from taking root in every single public school in our nation? It doesn't matter what political party you belong to, or what religion you profess, or if you don't profess one at all. Vulnerable kids who simply don't fit stereotypical norms need us to raise our voices on their behalf today. Be not afraid. Speaking up will change our schools into communities that can proclaim every child is born in exactly the right body. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Bernadette.
If we can go ahead and show the video, please.
The night when my daughter explained to me what happened to her, I felt devastated. I felt angry. I felt betrayed. I mean, I would have never thought, who would think that when I dropped my child off at school, I never would think that she would be sexually assaulted in a bathroom by another little boy.
How did this happen? How is it that a mom drops off her daughter at school, at kindergarten, expecting her to be safe, expecting her to be supervised, and somehow during the course of the day, her 5-year-old daughter is assaulted in the privacy of her girls' bathroom and assaulted by a boy, for that matter, who apparently was allowed to be there. How does this happen?
When you send your daughter to school, when you see her off in the morning, you have a level of expectation that you're not going to be worried about them, and they're not going to be exposed to something that you're not aware of as a parent. I learned about the transgender policy from my wife Gina. She was on Facebook, and she just happened to be on the Facebook page of the superintendent and got wind of this policy that they were enacting that was going to open bathrooms, locker rooms, sports teams, overnight lodging to both sexes.
For such a significant policy to be communicated via Facebook was, just not how, it's not how it should be done, and it's not how City Schools of Decatur typically operates. I began asking around to other parents to see if they had heard about this or if they were familiar with this, and not a single parent that I had spoken to was aware.
The concerned parents of Decatur legitimately wanted to work with the district, with the superintendent, with the school board to help them to understand what their concerns were and to find medium ground. They met with the superintendent, they wrote several letters to him, they emailed to him, and each time that they expressed their concerns, they got the same consistent response: we hear you, we understand, but in essence, we're doing nothing to change this policy. Then in the October school board meeting, the policy was placed on the agenda, and that was quite a meeting. At the October meeting, many people spoke, but one was particularly memorable, and he was the former chairman of the Board of Pardons and Paroles. Given his understanding of human nature, he specifically testified to his concern that this policy would be used by young boys to gain access to girls in private settings for mischievous purposes. And it was as if he was prophetic, because that is precisely what has happened.
My daughter stated to me that she was in class and she asked the teacher if she could go to the bathroom. And the teacher said yes. So she was in the bathroom and she was pulling up her pants when one of her classmates came in the bathroom, a little boy. She tried to leave out of the bathroom. The little boy pushed her against the bathroom stall, basically pinned her up against there. She asked him to stop. He wouldn't. He took his fingers and he was penetrating her through her pants. And she asked him to stop and stated several times that it hurt. He refused. Once he was done, she went to class. I asked her if she told anyone about it. She started crying, saying, "No, Mama, I didn't tell nobody, but I didn't ask him to come in the bathroom with me. I didn't know he was gonna do that." And I told her that it's not her fault. It was just not her fault. He should not have been in that bathroom.
This case, more than any other that I have heard about, and I've talked with some colleagues, demonstrates the real life consequences of these policies. This is not theory. Okay. And it begs the question, what rights do we as parents have to guard our children against such a thing happening to our children? And Rebecca, I have to just insert this here real quickly. Perhaps unions need to be called unionized or organized syndicates in the model of the mafia organizations. So that really is what we need to talk about. And I do not believe by any stretch that we are helpless. So I want to pose quickly 5 different ways in which parents can assert our rights in this arena to guard our children. First of all, parents have the right to be informed and to notice. If you notice, this case is a paradigm. It was passed in the dark, and typically, oftentimes, these policies, as we know, are passed in the dark. There's a reason why cockroaches like the dark. And so we need to be very present at this point in our schools. We need to understand what is happening there and demand to know what is being implemented in our schools. We have the right to prior notice of intended policy changes and uncover when that is violated, because potentially you have a cause of action to undo policies if there has been a lack of proper notice under state law. And we also have the right to be heard. Again, going back to the school board meetings, show up. We need to be heard about these things. Utilize the resources that Emilie and our organizations have made to inform, to put the school boards on notice, to inform them, to give them a balanced perspective of the information that's out there, of the harms that these treatments and this ideology causes to children. Use this video. If you contact me, and it's on the internet, or co-counsel, which is the Alliance Defending Freedom, use this video, play it for them, put them on notice of the liability that they potentially face if they go forward with these policies and someone else is harmed. Parents have the right to expect transparency. School board actions are supposed to be done in the light. Most states, in fact, I believe all states, have sunshine laws, have open meetings acts, open records statutes. See if those statutes have been violated, because you might have a cause of action if you've not gone past the statute of limitations to bring an action in state court to undo them. Unfortunately, in our situation, we were past the statute of limitations. Use open meetings request, or excuse me, open records request as your weapon. You can uncover what's been going on, extraordinary emails like we did about conversations that were done oftentimes illegally and in the dark. Again, is the statute of limitations not passed? You might have a way to undo this. Parents have the right to hold school leaders legally accountable. I want to come back to this case. Where this case stands right now is that we, along again with counsel of the Alliance Defending Freedom, we filed a complaint with the United States Department of Education Office for Civil Rights for a violation of Title IX. This is a violation of Title IX. And the policy is what is the hook to hold the school liable. Right now, as we speak, in fact, we got another witness that needs to be interviewed. It is being investigated by the federal government. And the Trump administration has completely changed the posture of the federal government in response to these kinds of complaints. We actually have some hope. In fact, we know it is being taken seriously. It's being scrutinized very carefully. Now, the wonderful thing about these complaints is that you don't have to have an attorney file them for you. It is helpful to have an attorney advise you, and in our case, we did. But you don't have to have an attorney file it for you. Of course, consult with one. Secondly, and this is something that we've not really done effectively, is to use the federal courts to file an action for violation of the fundamental parental rights under the United States Constitution. Federal courts, in truth, have held that it is within the school's authority to regulate their facilities. And that's what they claim they're doing. We're just regulating facilities, nothing to see here. But in truth, gender identity affirmation policies, granting access to privacy facilities based on a child's feelings, as opposed to objective, verifiable physiology, are aimed at compelling children to affirm and normalized by their captive cooperation and unscientific and harmful ideology. It is compelling them to accept an entirely new, radical belief system of the fundamental nature of man. It is conscripting our children into participation in a social science experiment without our consent. In short, it is using facilities policies as tools of indoctrination. And it is facilitating social contagion among students. These, at the core, this is what has parents troubled so much. I, as a parent, yes, I don't want my daughter to have to take care of her needs with a boy potentially being there, but it is deeper than that. It is the idea that my daughter could be by her actions compelled to cooperate with a falsity. And the schools know this, and the teachers' unions know this. They recognize actions speak louder than words. And so by getting the, you understand what I'm saying? This is what, now, what is helpful about this is that there is case law that says, on the other hand, that once a school crosses the lines from educational concerns, legitimate pedagogical concerns, to now then affirming or changing a child's belief system, indoctrinating children, prying into private family matters, you now have crossed into the realm of the parent. And there's case law to suggest that there's a viable cause of action here. There's juice left in this orange, folks. I believe we need to squeeze this. And if you bring it together with now forced pronoun usage, which is now violations of freedom of speech, free exercise violations, if you find those smoking guns of the activist documents that are it expressly training teachers how to get around parents to affirm children and to keep it from parents, I think we have some viable causes of action here. And that is why our organization is formed. My law partner and I, we have formed the Child and Parental Rights Campaign to defend parents to be able to guard their children against this ideology. I will say real quickly, we also need to hold school boards and leaders accountable politically. We need to organize and vote them out of office. In Decatur right now, there's an election going on, and several school board members are losing their seat this year. We're pretty sure about that. We need to find champions in the legislatures to bring sensible legislation to push back on this, and we have several other ideas, and we're talking with others with several pieces of legislation. So here's the closing thought. We simply cannot accept the false premise that there's nothing we can do. It's a falsity. It's yet another falsity, okay? If we have the gumption to go against the syndicated, organization like the unions, we can do this and not accept the premise that our children are the mere creatures of the state. They are not. Our children are created by us. They are entrusted to us to safeguard them, to be able to grow healthy in their own bodies, and to know who they truly are. So we need to take back the authority that both our Creator and nature and our laws and our Constitution have given us. We stand with you to do that, and I thank you so very much for being able to be here today.
Great. Well, thank you, Bernadette, and thanks to each of you for your excellent presentations. I know we're running a little bit over, so we won't do questions, but I would just like to kind of tie it all together and pull one thread. I mean, we see how this is happening in the district schools across the country, in our public school systems, across those 14,000 plus school boards that we see across the country. But something that Derek mentioned in his comments is so important and kind of might have gone over everybody's heads, but this accreditation piece really is critical. That is how we are seeing so many of these policies enter into private schools across the country and be a precondition for participation in what is otherwise wonderful movement on the school choice front across the country. So we need to be vigilant across the board, whether it's public or private schools. So thank you all for that. Really appreciate it. And please join me in thanking our panelists one more time.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you to all the panelists. Now, as the healthcare panel comes on stage, I want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Ryan Anderson. He's the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow at Heritage. He has many accomplishments to his name, but I'll just mention one that I think is particularly pertinent today. He has filed 2 amicus briefs that were cited by 2 Supreme Court judges in 2 different cases. He also filed amicus briefs in yesterday's trio of Supreme Court cases where plaintiffs asked the Supreme Court to judicially alter the meaning of the word sex to mean sexual orientation and gender identity in Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act on employment. But the outcome of these cases will go far beyond employment. They could alter privacy in single-sex spaces like bathrooms, like homeless shelters, and single-sex events like women and girls sports. The outcome of these cases could also impact the medical profession and limit the ability of medical professionals to treat patients with gender dysphoria, including children, according to their own best medical judgment, rather than according to transgender ideology. That, in turn, would narrow the treatment options for the parents of children with gender dysphoria. This panel will illuminate the harms of politicizing this medical treatment. And I also just want to mention Ryan's book, When Harry Became Sally, which is one of the best resources that pulls together science and medicine and philosophy to describe what the transgender movement is trying to do and what is the best way to treat people with gender dysphoria. Thank you.
Into the morning. I realize it's been a long morning already. Is Dr. Zanga with us? Oh, perfect, he is. So just give me a second as everyone gets here. In 2007, Boston Children's Hospital became, as its website brags, quote, the first major program in the United States to focus on transgender children and adolescents. Today, a dozen years later, more than 45 pediatric gender clinics have opened their doors for our nation's children. Parents are told that puberty-blocking drugs and cross-sex hormones may be the only way to prevent their child from committing suicide. In government-funded studies, doctors are performing double mastectomies on 13-year-old girls because medical experts deem such medical procedures necessary. Meanwhile, 17 states have passed laws banning medical professionals from helping a child to identify with his or her own body. And yet in all 50 states, doctors can prescribe testosterone to girls and estrogen to boys. Doctors can perform mastectomies on the healthy bodies of healthy girls. And already parents have lost custody of their teenage daughter because they disagreed with doctors who wanted to prescribe her testosterone. Transition affirming therapies are virtually untested and they inflict lasting harms. And instead of providing parents with the medical information they need to make evidence-based choices, many parents report feeling bullied and pressured into affirming the transition procedures for their children. And so it's essential that we start a conversation on these medical therapies, these medical interventions into young people's bodies. And that's why we've assembled this closing panel of today's summit on the medical risks, the health risks to children. We have an expert panel coming at it from 4 different but complementary perspectives. First, we'll hear from Walt Heyer. And I don't want to say too much about Walt because Walt is going to introduce himself as he shares his story. But Walt is a prolific writer and speaker. He runs a website called sexchangeregret.com, where he has helped hundreds of people who have regretted their sex change procedures and have detransitioned to identify with their original bodily design. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Joseph Zanga. Dr. Zanga is the past president of the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American College of Pediatricians. He's the former chief of pediatrics for Columbus Children's Hospital, the former Catherine and Max Ray Joyner Distinguished Chair in Primary Care at the Brody School of Medicine at East Carolina University, and the former chair of pediatrics at Loyola University School of Medicine in Chicago. Then we'll hear from Matt Sharp. Matt is the senior counsel at Alliance Defending Freedom, one of those law firms that was at the Supreme Court yesterday, a law firm that has won several Supreme Court victories in just the past several years. He's a graduate of Vanderbilt Law School. He's been with ADF for almost a decade now. I believe he joined in 2010. And he's been focusing on the rights of students, both their religious freedom rights on college campuses and their privacy rights. And so he's going to be sharing with us some of those insights, especially for the laws, how it intersects with parental rights, how it intersects with doctors' rights. And then lastly, but not least, we'll hear from Aaron Baer. Aaron is the president of Citizens for Community Values, which is the Ohio-based Family Policy Council. Previously, he worked in the Arizona Family Policy Council, the Center for Arizona Policy. He also worked in the Arizona Attorney General's office. And it's in his state that the parents have lost custody. That happened not in California, not in New York, not in Massachusetts, where we would have expected this to happen. It happened in Ohio. And so Aaron in particular will share some of that story and what can be done to prevent this from taking place in your state. So please join me in welcoming the panel, and we'll hear from Walt first.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate this opportunity to speak today with this distinguished panel. I'm not a PhD, I'm not a doctor, but I want to put a human face on the destructive side of becoming a transgender, as I did for 8 years. I went through the procedure. But we shouldn't be surprised when we hear about the early sexualization of children being involved with this, that's growing to proportions that we never could have imagined happening. But if we think back to how transgenderism started, it was Alfred Kinsey, Harry Benjamin, and John Money. They were pedophile activists. They thought it was totally appropriate for adult men to have sex with young boys. So if we can look into their thinking, we shouldn't be surprised at what we're seeing today. And this is what has transpired. These are the consequences of allowing this travesty and this ridiculous thing to start the way it has. And let me tell you, affirming children into a cross-gender identity is child abuse. Let's be honest. It's not physical abuse, but it's psychological abuse. It's emotional abuse, and it's sexual abuse. We cannot kid ourselves any longer, and our children are being destroyed. I, myself, was cross-dressed at the age of 4, 1944, 74 years ago. And as a result of that, I became gender distressed, to the point to where I underwent gender reassignment surgery after struggling because of being cross-dressed in a purple dress at the age of 4. We cannot ignore how devastating it is to young people to cross-dress them and affirm them. Do not kid yourselves. I'm here as a witness to this, that I'm still today stand before you with a mutilated body and a life that was destroyed in many ways, redeemed by Christ, certainly, but destroyed because I was affirmed and told how cute I looked, how wonderful it was, and went to a gender therapist who said, all you need to do is have hormones and reassignment surgery. That was in 1981. I underwent the surgery in 1983 because they said this is the treatment for gender confusion. Wrong. It's destructive. It's not treatment. It's further abuse. This is the physical abuse, cutting off body parts and filling someone with hormones is one of the most destructive things you can do. And it's not repairable. There's things that cannot be restored. I'm here as a witness to tell you we have to stop this nonsense. And further, fortunately, I looked into the stacks of the books when I was studying psychology at UC Santa Cruz and discovered that people who identify with gender identity disorder also have disorders like body dysmorphia. They have autogynephilia, transvestic fetishes. They have other psychological issues that cause them to behave as a transgender. They're not born transgender. that adults are perpetrating on our young people today, and our schools are complicit in this. Schools have become the activist indoctrination location for children. And fortunately, my life was redeemed and restored, and my website, Sex Change Regret, we've had the opportunity to reach out to people around the world, and we continue to help people every single day. We get emails from people, Walt, 6 days after surgery, I regret this. Can you help me? Can you get my life back? 3 weeks after surgery, 6 years after surgery, all the way up to 2 people 30 years after reassignment surgery. It took me 15 years, Walt, to admit that I regret this. Can you help me? People today, in the hundreds, in the thousands, regret having been caught up in this madness. And thankfully, we're able to help them. And I plead with you to listen to the doctors and these messages today. There is nothing more important than a stable foundation of a country is the family. And this is an issue that's ripping families apart and tearing lives apart. We have to understand that a sound country, society, is built on families. And ripping them apart with this ideology is also destroying our families, and we see it every day in our schools. Thank you.
Where do I begin? You've heard a lot this morning. I'm going to give you some more. And I'm going to say a little bit about what we know and then ask and answer some questions. What do we know? Well, we're going to talk about definitions. We're going to talk about science, or what's not science. Children's brains, a key thing that we all have to understand. Sex or gender change, and then what do the medical organizations in this country say about all of this? Gender dysphoria. God, what a term. Do we really know what it means? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that anybody does, but we use it very glibly. The American Psychological Association has decided this is the term that we're all going to talk about. But, you know, one of the things that they did do, is they made some specifications. A child who, particularly, I'm going to talk about children, but it's for adults as well. It's got to be associated with significant distress or impairment in function, lasting at least 6 months. And you have to appear with 6 of 8 different criteria before you can be diagnosed with that significant impairment of function, significant distress. I work with a lot of pediatricians and family physicians around the country, and I have for 100 years now. On issues like this, they sometimes can't seem to be bothered with all of this minutia. And a child who comes in and says, "You call me John, but I'm really Jane," and a parent who says, "You've been treating my son, who's now my daughter," and the doctor says, "Well, okay, let me see how I can help you with this child who is in this transition." Sex versus gender. What's sex? Now, you know, it's kind of like what somebody once said about pornography. You know it when you see it? It's what our body habitus is. It's how we look at ourselves in the mirror after we get out of the shower. It's our external and internal organs, it's the way we function, it's the hormones that our body generates. But it's something more important than that, or at least as important, and that is every cell of our body is the sex of our body. In every cell of our body, there's an X chromosome and a Y chromosome for males, and 2 X chromosomes for females. So gender, well, you know, for thousands of years, sex and gender were exactly the same thing. People obviously in antiquity understood that there were 2 X's for females and an X and a Y for males. Though we scientists didn't discover that until fairly recently. What is gender? Gender has no basis in science. It's a construct. It has no basis in science. There is no science that says you can be any gender you want to be. You are male or female, and nothing that you do can change that basic scientific fact. Change the appearance. We can dress, we can look, we can have surgery, but we cannot change who we are. And that goes for our brains as well. And the children's brains, very, very critical in this whole discussion. Are we born with an encyclopedic knowledge of things? No, hardly. We are born with a pretty blank slate. Oh yes, we do learn things in utero, but we're a blank slate. Our brains are plastic. They can be molded. And we start molding them from the earliest days. Parents teach their children, and children respond to subtle cues about love and feeding and toilet training and a whole host of things. And if a parent says to John, "You really are Jane," or to Jane, "You really are John," and starts dressing the child, as Walt said, in sex-inappropriate clothing, treating the child as if the child is the opposite sex, that's what the child begins to incorporate into their very plastic brain. And as they get older, they begin to think, yes, indeed, you know, Mommy, Daddy, they were right. Gosh, you know, Mommy saw me putting on her shoes. And instead of saying, "Please, don't wear my shoes, John, you'll ruin them," she says, "Oh, John, don't you look cute wearing my high heels." We imprint that kind of message in the child's very plastic brain. And children, when do children's brains mature? When do they become fairly fixed, non-plastic, can't be molded so much anymore? In their mid-20s. Gosh, is this something new? Is this something we just discovered? Well, actually, we've known this for thousands of years. The first mention of it in any kind of written form was Socrates, a long, long time ago. And William Shakespeare wrote it in at least one of his plays. The brain does not mature until the mid-20s. Children cannot make executive decisions. They cannot decide they can't decide what they want to grow up to be in life, much less whether they are boys or girls. And yet, we are saying, the medical profession is saying, oh yes, you're a 5-year-old, yes, you can decide that even though you look like a boy, you're really a girl. That's craziness. And sure, maybe you want to ignore thousands of years of observation. But in the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s, throughout the 90s, we proved by MRIs and functional MRIs, by PET scans and a variety of other things, that the brain actually really doesn't physically mature until the mid-20s. We know this. And our organizations, our medical organizations, are very sincere about saying that a child, therefore, an adolescent, therefore, can't decide things like smoking. They should not smoke. They should not drink. They should not drive a car. They shouldn't do a lot of things because they are not mature enough to be able to do those things. And yet we say that a 5-year-old can decide that they're the wrong sex? This is crazy. This is unscientific. This is malpractice as well as child abuse. We are committing uncontrolled experiments on our children, and that's dangerous. Oh, but wait. We're going to send them for counseling. Yes, as Walt said, you're not allowed to counsel anymore except to say to the child, well, Jane, you really want to be John? Well, fine. Let me help you to be John. That we're allowed to do. Why? Because government has passed laws that say that we are allowed to. We're not allowed, on the other hand, to say, no, Jane, you're going to grow out of this. You know, don't keep thinking this way. Let me help you to think. No, that's not allowed. Our government is committing malpractice. They're practicing medicine without a license. They're telling us what we can and cannot do. Of course, we're acquiescing, and that's really dangerous. So we provide inappropriate counseling. Then we provide drugs, Lupron. All right, we prevent them from growing through puberty. There are adverse effects. They do things to the body which promotes the development of stroke. Increased body mass index, gain weight. Decrease in their high-density lipoprotein levels, the good lipoproteins, the things that protect you from heart attacks. Now, a lot of this medical stuff is reversible. The mental health stuff is not. We've done again. We've said to the child, we can do the kinds of things that help you to achieve your goal of changing your sex. And then, of course, there's the testosterones or cross-sex hormones, testosterone for girls who want to be boys, and estrogens for boys who want to be girls. And both of those and other drugs that we can use have adverse side effects. And some of those side effects are physically as well as mentally not reversible. So we're stuck. And what are the American medical organization? The American Academy of Pediatrics. All right, the largest pediatric organization in the country, 67 or so thousand members. The decisions are made by a group of about 14 people and then promulgated to the rest of us. Well, those are elected people. So obviously we must be electing people who believe what we believe. Hardly. In the last election for president and other officers of the Academy, 14% of the electorate voted. And many of them probably didn't know who they were voting for or what they were voting for. Now, this is common in all of our medical organizations. They've been taken over by people who are politically correct and in some cases interested in, and I say this about individuals, not the organization, this is a way to make money. And it's unfortunate that we're doing these uncontrolled experiments on our children. I liken it to an adolescent coming to me, usually a female, who looks very thin, pale, malnourished perhaps, who, on a chart is really very much underweight. I said, oh, doctor, I'm fat. I really, really need some medication. I really need some diet pills. And I need some recommendations on what I can take to purge me if I do eat. Because I cannot gain any more weight. This is terrible. Do I prescribe medication for that? No, I don't. This child is suffering, just like the child who thinks they're the wrong sex might be suffering. They have functional impairment, just like the child who thinks they're the wrong sex might have some functional impairment. Do I give them diet pills? No. I counsel them, and I send them to someone who can provide the appropriate counseling so they understand what they're doing to themselves, the harm they're causing. And the government has never said, I can't do that. No. We need to do something. And you have to help us. You have to tell your pediatricians and the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology and the American Academy of Family Physicians and others that they cannot keep doing these experiments upon our children. It's time to stop. It's time to speak up and tell everyone that what they should know, that boys will always be boys and girls will always be girls, and we have to help them understand why and how to do that. Because if they go through puberty, if they get into their adolescence, more than 90% or 85 to 95% of them will decide, you know, I really am satisfied with my body. I really am a boy. I really am a girl. And that's the way I'm going to live the rest of my life. Thank you. I don't need this surgery. I don't need these medications. I don't need to remove good functional body parts. And so I thank you for listening, and I thank you in advance for going out there and preaching what we have been teaching all morning. Thank you.
So I'd like to start off with a little talk about language, and this piggybacks directly off what Walt and Dr. Zango were talking about. You'll hear about these so-called conversion therapy laws, and it's a very powerful terminology that the other side has used to frame the debate. But I think we need to accurately describe what these laws are. These are counseling censorship laws. These are laws that are directed at censoring the ability of counselors and the children and adults that they work with to have open, honest conversations about the counseling goals that they want to pursue. So this is the government censoring these goals, these topics, and these conversations. So you'll see me intentionally avoid conversion therapy and talk about these as counseling censorship laws, as we need to accurately do. So as Ryan mentioned, these laws are prevalent in about 17 to 18 states. But even more worrisome is how many cities and municipalities are starting to pass much more aggressive local ordinances that seek to censor certain counseling. Whereas most of the state laws are focused on outlawing this for minors and punishing professionals that engage with it, the local versions often go much, much further than that. So let's dive into those a little bit. How about an example? So I'm going to pick on Delaware, they're nearby, and look at a recent law that they passed dealing with one of these. And here's how it defines it. Conversion therapy means any practice or treatment that seeks to change an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity, including any effort to change behaviors or gender expressions or to eliminate or reduce sexual or romantic attractions. It does not mean counseling to help an individual who is seeking to undergo a gender transition or is in the process of undergoing a transition, or that provides acceptance, support, and understanding. So look at how this is set up. Let's break that down real quick. Any effort to change behaviors. So something as simple as you're talking with a 5-year-old child, and the child says, it's a male, and the child says, I'd like to dress like a girl. And you say, no, I would actually prefer you to dress like a guy. You're changing behaviors. And that now falls within the scope of these laws. If you have an individual that struggles with a pornography addiction to same-sex pornography, and you say, look, this is very unhealthy for you, I'd like to work with you as your counselor to overcome this, you are changing behaviors as it relates to attractions, and you are now under the scope of this law. Let's look at even further of how it only allows counseling towards one goal. So it says you can support, accept, affirm someone that's undergoing a transition or that's seeking affirmation. So again, if an individual walks in and says, as we brought up earlier, I want to live as the opposite sex, I want your help, counselor, to do that, counselor is a free way to drive down to help the individual achieve that goal. But the moment the individual, the client, comes in and says, I have these attractions. Let's say you have a married mother of 3, happily married to her husband, but starts to feel close attraction to a female friend of hers. And she goes to her counselor and says, look, I believe consistent with my faith and what's best for my family, I want to be loyal to my husband. Will you help me with that? Immediately, the counselor is going to put up a stop sign and say, I'm sorry, we cannot proceed any further because now I am helping you to change behaviors, to change attractions, and the government says that is an off-limits road for us to proceed down. Now, if you want to pursue that same-sex relationship, let's go for it. But if you want help overcoming it, you cannot go that direction. See what the government's doing? Certain views, certain goals, certain objections are now being censored under these laws. And the threats of punishment here are very severe. So, for example, the counselors that are engaged in this profession, this is not a slap on the wrist that they face. Let's go back to Delaware's law. What's the consequence of a counselor offering these services? Again, at the client's choosing. Practitioners will be subject to all disciplinary procedures available for individuals engaged in that profession. So it's everything from a censure to being written up to losing your license. And let's be clear, you get a misconduct allegation in one state, that's going to affect your ability as you go to other states to be able to practice the counseling profession. So you're not only censoring counselors in their one-on-one conversations with their clients, but you're affecting their lifelong ability to continue to help individuals. And again, this is not purely hypothetical. In fact, ADF is representing a Orthodox Jewish counselor in New York, DeVos Schwartz, who has for over 50 years helped individuals of the Jewish Orthodox faith seek to live consistent as it relates to marriage and family. And because of a law passed in New York City, is now being subject to the very threat of being shut down for his longstanding practice, one that has helped countless individuals who have come to him seeking help. And Dr. Schwartz is just one of numerous counselors like this across the country that are facing the impact that these laws are having. But we can't just focus on sort of these general laws, because what we're starting to see is actually a new breed of these laws that go even further. And so this actually popped up within the past year in a couple of states, but I'd actually like to travel to Michigan just for a second. So this was in February 2018, and a local church was offering a seminar for its teens, for the girls in its youth group, called Unashamed Identity Workshop. It was responding to a lot of these issues going on and helping girls understand, if you're dealing with identity confusion and thinking you may be a guy or rapid onset gender dysphoria or some of these things, we want to let you know your identity can be found in Jesus Christ. So this was very much a spiritual retreat that this church was offering. Was word of it got out, the 2 state representatives in Michigan issued a public press release asking the state attorney general to launch an investigation into this church for their seminar. They asked for it to investigate Metro City Church for a violation of the Michigan Consumer Protection Act and to investigate whether the church committed unfair, unconscionable, or deceptive practices. In other words, what they're saying now is not only are we going to go after the counselors, we're going to go after any organization, including a church, claiming that the simple offering of help to individuals seeking it as they struggle with questions about their gender identity or sexual attractions is a unconscionable and unfair, deceptive practice under state law. And you start getting into these consumer protection acts, now you're not only just the board of professions coming after you, it enables any private citizen who hears an advertisement from this church to be able to file a consumer citizen lawsuit against that church, against that organization. Now, if this was just a couple of legislators, we may dismiss it, but we have seen laws like this introduced, both California, AB 2943, and Nebraska with LB 167, both in 2019. So not only a deep blue state like California, but even heart of America, Nebraska. Now, fortunately, through allies in our state, the California, Nebraska, and family councils, they were able to defeat those laws, but that shows you the momentum is expanding this to go after more and more providers, more and more individuals. Now, let me go to one last iteration of this, the next frontier, getting into parental rights. Because not only are they going after the profession, not only are going after the organizations, but even parents themselves. So we saw laws introduced in Massachusetts and once again in Nebraska to make it child abuse for a parent to allow their child to be exposed to this type of counseling. And remember, the definition we're talking about is any effort to change behaviors. So imagine you're a parent of a child, a daughter, and you allow your daughter to go to that conference in Michigan at that church. Would that be child abuse to simply allow your child to go hear discussions about embrace your God-given biological sex, embrace your identity in Christ, and for them to say, that sounds like you're engaging in counseling, censorship, conversion therapy, we're going to investigate you for felony child abuse. That is the frontier where these laws are going. And this is not just a state issue, because if you look at the findings in the Equality Act, H.R. 5, and other federal SOGI laws, Fairness for All, and proposals like that, you find that they are citing to conversion therapy, to the counseling, as an act of discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation. So the clear path that they're pushing is to make this a federal law that would censor the ability of individuals to go pursue all paths. And that's what we're advocating for here. We're not trying to do a one-size-fits-all approach. No one on this panel is seeking to do so, but rather to ensure that everyone has the freedom to pursue the counseling that best fits them and the goals they're trying to achieve. And let me finish with this with one quick word of hope, because we are actually starting to see some of these laws fall. I'll return to the DeVos Schwartz case, because shortly after we filed the lawsuit, and actually just a little over a week ago, New York City Council, in response to the lawsuit, repealed their existing law that would have prohibited DeVos Schwartz and others like him from being able to engage in this. We've also seen victories in Florida, where a court down there invalidated all of these local ones, saying, no, cities, you don't have authority to engage in the regulation of profession. That belongs to the state. And we're even seeing the Supreme Court calling some of this precedent into question. So I'll end with a word of hope that if we continue to push back on this, not only tell the stories of how this counseling has helped individuals, but pursue the legal options, we can win and bring about the opportunity for everyone to get the counseling they need, and not a one-way street that forces kids into these harmful procedures we've been talking about. Thank you.
So to start, I must say I'm in a little bit of a tough spot here, because the men on this panel and a lot of the folks in this room are typically the people I plagiarize when I speak on these issues. So I've got to come up with some new material here. But I'll start by just saying the story I'm going to share with you in many ways ties together much of what we've discussed here today in all aspects, from culture to parental rights to education, and certainly to health care. And I think Ryan did a terrific job of highlighting the story I'm going to share with you is not out of from our dear friends in California or from Massachusetts, but from Ohio. And in Ohio terms, we would say it's not from Cleveland or Columbus, it's from Cincinnati, which is generally considered one of the more conservative areas of the state. It's where my organization was founded. And what we saw in this case was really unprecedented in so many ways. You had a 16-year-old girl who was diagnosed with gender dysphoria. She was having suicidal thoughts and was genuinely feeling like she was a boy. That she was going through this situation. And the parents, a Catholic family, this is their oldest daughter, sought to get her help. And took her to Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Cincinnati Children's Hospital had one of these transgender clinics. They didn't realize what this was, but it was a clinic that billed itself as a place to help children with gender dysphoria. So they took their child there, and they went through this months-long process of the child being there, and often to the point where the parents were being blocked out of being told what was being told to their 16-year-old child. The more they would seek information, the more they would seek trying to understand what was happening, the more they were getting resistance. And ultimately, they were even told at times they couldn't take their child out of the clinic, out of the hospital's custody. And ultimately, what ended up happening was the child said that she did want to transition to become a boy. And the clinic recommended she get put on high-dose testosterone. To which the parents said no. At that time, the clinic reached out to Hamilton County Job and Family Services, which is a part of the state Job and Family Services, basically reached out to the state. And Job and Family Services went forward and filed neglect and abuse charges against these parents. because they denied them, they were denying their child this gender, this hormone therapy. What's important about this case, when I first heard about this case, I was skeptical. Having worked in the Attorney General's office in Arizona, and just generally being around some child custody cases in the past, I'll tell you, the vast majority of the time when you hear these cases, there's dealing with child custody and those types of things, there's a lot of other extenuating circumstances. So we really approached this case very cautiously to say, okay, was there something else going on? Because to file neglect and abuse charges against parents is a very serious step, and especially in a state like Ohio, where we do have a child welfare crisis. We have over 16,000 kids in foster care. The last thing we need to be doing is putting more kids into the foster care and adoptive system. Well, as we looked into it and we started seeing the findings that the state put forward, they actually did an in-home study. And the in-home study came back with nothing. They came back with no evidence of abuse, no evidence. They found a safe home for the child. But they still filed the neglect and abuse charges, and it was solely on the basis of this denial of the parents not wanting to put the child on high-dose testosterone. From that point, they went into a long litigation process. And ultimately, in February of 2018, Judge Sylvia Hendon, a visiting judge in Hamilton County, so she was no longer an elected judge, she was filling in because the court was backlogged, ultimately ruled that the child, at this point 17, relatively months away from turning 18, was going to be removed from parents' custody and put into the custody of the maternal grandparents. This is precedent setting. We had never seen anything like this, and like I said, it was shocking that this came out of Cincinnati of all places. But there was more as we dug into this case. There was more that really jumped out to us. I think one of the most shocking things that jumped out to us was this transgender clinic at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Cincinnati Children's Hospital has a phenomenal reputation nationally, much like Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, that also has one of these clinics in them. But what the judge found in her ruling was that the lead doctor at the transgender clinic said that testified on the record that 100% of the children that show up at their clinic and say they are struggling with gender dysphoria or a sense that they are in the wrong body, they get recommended to be put on hormone therapy. So there is no let's talk this through. It's not to go off too far on a tangent here. It's a little bit like the abortion industry with Planned Parenthood, where if you go into Planned Parenthood, you're probably going to end up getting an abortion. When you go to this clinic, they're 100% of the time they are recommending that the children get put on an experimental procedure, as we've seen, as has been testified here today, that this is highly experimental. And on the basis of that alone, though, that the experimental procedures and the recommendation of these doctors, that is enough to remove the child from their custody. So that case is done. The parents weren't able to appeal based on a timeline. They are now actually, though, they have filed the child went on to be in the maternal grandparents' custody. They're now in college. The parents have now filed a federal lawsuit, a civil claim against Hamilton County Job and Family Services and Cincinnati Children's Hospital for in essentially wrongful imprisonment because the hospital would not release the child to parents' custody and all the other sort of host of things of deception that the clinic has done. The parents have told me outright that it became very clear that the counselors at Cincinnati Children's Hospital were coaching the child on what to say in order to be able to make these claims in court. And you just saw all that played out. The case originally, the civil case was dismissed at the district court level. It's now on appeal in the Sixth Circuit. We're waiting on a decision there. So what can be done about this situation? Because I'll tell you, this is one situation, and if it's happening in Cincinnati, it's happening likely all over the country. So what can be done about this? Well, there's a few things. I think first and foremost, especially at the local level, but also at the national level, we need to stop sexual orientation, gender identity laws. Stephanie Curry did a phenomenal job of explaining those. But these SOGI laws, as actually Citizens for Community Values and a number of the family policy councils in this room filed in an amicus brief in the Harris case to the Supreme Court, is that these sexual orientation, gender identity laws, or the redefinition of sex in law, really puts in overdrive or gives the government what they need to be able to make this the standard operating procedure of job and family services or whatever child protective custody services you have in your state and your community. So stopping those sexual orientation, gender identity laws are a top priority. There's other things, though, that go into this as well. We're right now at CCV, we introduced this bill last year. We're going to be reintroducing it this year after we do some fine tuning, is we're going to introduce what we call our Parents' Rights Act. And what essentially this bill will say is that you can't do this. You can't remove a child from parents' custody because they do not want to go down a specific path of treatment for gender dysphoria. They're denying hormones or denying the social transition. I will say there's a little bit of conversation that I think is worthwhile having around, do we ban the drugs? Do we actually go full out and we try to prohibit these procedures? And I can see the merit in wanting to do that. There are some difficulties that go along with that, that as opposed to going the pure parental rights side, which is the avenue we're going down, even though, I think Walt is 100% right that these hormone therapies is child abuse when you truly look at them. There's just a third element in here that I want to bring in, and that goes to the education side of this as well, the curriculum side. And this is why SOGI matters so much. This is why all of this very much ties together. At the same time that this case was happening in Cincinnati, the owner of Pure Romance, one of the largest sex toy retailers in the country, who's based in Cincinnati, announced a $16 million gift to Cincinnati public schools to teach transgender sensitivity training to students and to teachers. And also, while all this is going on, the SOGI bill that is introduced in Ohio right now in our state Senate, that is about to be introduced in our state House, has a requirement for LGBT education in all of public schools. But they introduced this transgender sensitivity training, and you can now see the development of the pipeline that impacts healthcare, parental rights, and education. They bring in this sensitivity training. They make a child begin to question, is this truly my gender? Maybe the child goes to the parents and they tell the parents, or they go to the teacher and they tell the teacher, hey, I think I'm actually a girl, or I'm actually a boy, the opposite sex rather. And hopefully, maybe they go tell the parents, but as we've seen in Ohio and in other states, oftentimes they're not going to the parents, but let's say they do go to the parents, and the parents say, hold up, let's wait a minute before we go down this path of transitioning. Well, now they can just go to Job and Family Services and get them to file a neglect and abuse charge and remove that child from their custody. It's really changing our public schools, and I'm a product of the public schools. I love Warren G. Harding High School in Warren, Ohio, but we see what this is happening in our public schools and making it less and less of an option for parents today. So that's the story we have here, and I think if the one thing we can continue to echo time and time again is that the reason why this has become so en masse across the country is because folks have just been silenced, and they think they can move these things without speaking up. But the minute that we say the most power in terms of power that you have, there's the lobbyist, they have some impact. There's the pastor, they have some impact, but there's nothing as powerful as a ticked off mama. So I really want to call those mamas in particular to get in there.
So we're out of time, so I'm going to welcome Emilie Gao back up to give us some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to all the panelists. And now to conclude our day, I would like to introduce the new Vice President of the Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity, Charmaine Yost, to give us some closing comments.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. I see a lot of familiar faces, and we're so glad to be able to host you at Heritage today, and we'll look forward to having more of an opportunity to talk later at lunch. I wanted to, as we move into lunch, we really want to emphasize, after having a morning of you hearing from panelists, we want to hear back from you. And so to set the stage for that kind of dialogue, I wanted to start by telling a story. I wanted to talk a little bit about the kibbutz movement. We've heard a lot from the candidates running for president for 2020 about a move towards socialism. And the interesting thing is that socialism has actually been tried pretty aggressively in Israel through the kibbutz movement. And one of our friends over at AEI, at the American Enterprise Institute, Joshua Moravchik, has done a lot of research on this topic. And he said that as they were establishing the kibbutz movement, they wanted to practice socialism of a very pure kind. And one of the centerpieces of that effort was communal child rearing. And they felt so strongly about having communal child rearing that it was even gender neutral. So what do you think happened? They ended up, after a period of time, shifting back to family sleeping. And Moravchik said that in the end, rebellion against communal child rearing constituted the first major breakdown in the kibbutz system. And no offense to the wonderful men that we have joining us here today, but who do you think was the driving factor of breaking down the communal child rearing? It was the moms, right? They first, if I'm recollecting this correctly, it started with an undermining of the gender neutral approach to the communal child rearing because the women wanted to be closer to their children. But then as time went by, that wasn't even enough. They wanted to be closer to their own particular child. And I think that's really essential for us as we try to process all of the information that we've heard today, of thinking about what the collectivist impulse that we see around us means for the family. Because I know Lindsay and her panel talked about the collectivist impulse in education. We also see a collectivist impulse coming at us in the healthcare arena. One of the things that I'm very proud of from the Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity is that Lindsay and her team in the next couple of weeks will be releasing a book called The Not So Great Society. Did you talk about this already? You didn't? Okay, I'm gonna steal your thunder a little bit. We called it the Not So Great Society because in the context of education, because we think a lot of people are not aware that when Lyndon Johnson announced the Great Society, one of the 3 pillars was education. And so since he made his famous Great Society speech back in the 60s, we've spent $2 trillion, $2 trillion federal dollars on education. And what have we gotten for it? Well, I hope you'll get a copy of the book when it comes out and see some of the great charts and graphs that we have, but I'll give you a spoiler alert. All of them are flat. We got absolutely nothing from it. In fact, I would argue to you that that $2 trillion turned into a giant Ponzi scheme because what actually happened is that our money at the federal level went for state level bureaucrats who had to fill out a lot of forms for the federal level bureaucrats. And in the end, there wasn't a whole lot of education going on of the children. So if at the end of the day, it was just uneducated American children that we had to contend with, that would be one thing. But let's ask a broader question of what else are we seeing over the last 40 years or so? Well, one of the things we're seeing are really, really horrifying trends in what we are calling markers of despair. If the education lines are all flat, the lines on markers of despair are all stupendously upward in a really, really shocking factor. Before coming to the Heritage Foundation, I was working at the Office of National Drug Control Policy over at the White House. And of course, you know the numbers that are coming from that arena, from drug policy. In 2017, we saw some good news that the numbers of drug overdose deaths had trended downward slightly. We're still at 70,000 people a year dying from drug overdose deaths, and that's a huge increase from where we have been. But even more troubling are the rates of suicide. Just this last year, the CDC announced that suicide rates are the highest they've been since World War II. The the highest they've been since World War II. We're now seeing 14 out of every 100,000 people take their own lives. That's a 33% increase since 1999. So that's why I say thank you for being here. We're confronting some real situations that indicate a crisis amongst our children in our country. And that's one of the reasons I'm so excited and proud and happy to be a part of the team at the Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity. I think a lot, being relatively new, about what those words mean and what that means for our mission. But I'd argue to you today that it reflects the mission of why we've come together here today. If we want to not constantly be on defense, but move into offense, we need to think about what are the fundamentals? Where is the ground eroding around us? And I would argue that we can't lose sight of that question of what the fundamentals are. How do we undergird what the ground is underneath us? I would argue that protecting our children starts with the family. That's why I started with that amazing story about the kibbutz. No matter how hard we try, there's something inside us. And not just the moms, right? But when it comes to kids, they need to be with their families. And when we have solid families in our communities, this is why I like family, community, and opportunity for kids who don't have the benefit of being inside their biological family. Community can then come around to help undergird and shore up that shaky ground for them. Well, here's the problem. In addition to the markers of despair, there's also a rise of the isolated individual. Marriage itself is eroding around us. Cohabitation since 2007 has increased 29%. Cohabitation has gone up almost 30%. That's 18 million people involved. And these relationships, make no mistake about this, these relationships break up at twice the rate of marital relationships. Our young people are today being told, hey, just try it, live together, see if it works. Well, the sad reality is they're not told that more often than not, statistically, it doesn't work. They're much better off making the commitment and learning the skills of marriage, but we're not teaching that to them anymore. The median age at marriage for men today, does anybody know the answer to this? Anybody know what it is? 30. You guys are ahead of me on this one. It's 30. 30. For women, it's 28. This is a dramatic decline in the living arrangements of young people and even adults in America today. And of course, we could go and have a whole nother conversation about that, but that of course has a lot of downstream ramifications for children. And what I want us to think about and what I want to challenge us today is, where is the dialogue around these questions? Are we just going to turn a blind eye to the fact that the central civic organization, the foundation of how we build our communities, is eroding around us? We can't just talk about the outcomes of that erosion. We have to talk about that erosion itself. We had back 10, 20 years ago, we had a whole dialogue around welfare reform, and we moved from the AFDC program to the TANF program, lots of acronyms, but essentially we had a national dialogue about welfare reform, and we decided that dependency was increasing because we needed to look at the fact that more and more children were not being raised by their two biological parents. And so TANF, when it was passed, was meant to have a two-pronged approach. One was to increase jobs, and the other was to increase marriage. Well, the government, in its infinite wisdom, has done a pretty decent job at focusing on the jobs question, but not at all on the marriage question. And I would argue neither have we. So just to kind of wrap this up, I wanted to tell you something we've been talking about a lot inside the Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity in terms of an agenda for moving forward for us. And I want to share it with you because we'd like to get your feedback on it. A couple years ago, some of our friends over at the Brookings Institution and down at UVA with Brad Wilcox and also some scholars here at Heritage all kind of came together to start talking about something called the success sequence. Are you all familiar with this term? See a lot of familiarity. It basically says the data shows that you can decrease the rate of poverty among young people down to 2% if you emphasize with them, graduate from high school, get a job, and get married. To me, I could talk about this all day because you don't see that kind of results in social policy anywhere. 2%? I mean, and that's not that complicated, right? Graduate from high school, get a job, get married. These are all decisions that are within the reach of most young people. And the ways that we come around and support them in that also don't have to be terribly complicated. So let's be talking about that, of how do we undergird these foundational principles that put more supports around our young people. I say it's not complicated, but the final part of that success sequence is marriage, right? And what are we doing to come back to that foundational, that starting point of everything else? What I'd argue to you is we've seen a lot of failure in developing our federal Great Society programs, and that's because we fundamentally believe that it is great hearts that develop a great society. And as public policy makers, that's what we want to be focusing on. How are we teaching our young people to have great hearts? And I'd argue to you that the only place that starts, the only place that's really rooted is in the family. So thank you so much for being here today. I hope you'll enjoy lunch, and we'll look forward to having a great conversation. Yes, ma'am. Terrific. Tell us your name. Oh, I know you. Good to see you. Thanks for being here, Blanquita.
Slavery issue is human trafficking, and it affects children from the ages of younger than 6 months to teenagers.
Terrific. Thank you, Blanquita. And I just want to emphasize that moving into lunch is a great time for us to all have dialogue. So please do stay with us, and let's have some good conversations. Thanks much.
Let me just conclude briefly by saying we thank you all for joining us here in person and online for this important topic today, because every child deserves a chance to be a child, to be innocent, to be free from efforts by adults, to introduce them to what they are too young to understand or handle. To stem the tide of forces that are sexualizing children, there will need to be a broad and a diverse movement of courageous lawmakers, citizens, and parents. As you've heard today, there will be efforts to intimidate and to silence you. But when we stand together, we can make a difference. And that is already happening, as you've heard. Heritage is committed to supporting the efforts of our allies, and we encourage you to find out more about their work. We can all do something, whether it's speaking to people one-on-one or voicing concerns to schools or lawmakers. Many, many Americans are concerned about what is happening to children, about these unhealthy and dangerous trends, and they want to protect kids. We want to join with them and with you to protect our country's most precious resource, our children. Thank you again for being here, and we look forward to the discussions with you later.